Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where curiosity drifts as slowly as the tides, and where science is allowed to breathe without hurry. Tonight, we are going to step carefully into a question that has lived in the shadows of imagination. What if a day on Earth could last forever? Not forever in the way of hours refusing to pass, but forever in how it stretches, lingering, unhurried, carrying within it both origins and endings. A day so vast that it is measured not by clocks, but by rivers carving valleys, by forests exhaling into the sky, by oceans whispering against the bones of continents. A day so heavy it could only belong to the Jurassic. Before we walk further into that thought, I want to pause and ask you something small, something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you wrapped in the hum of a city where streetlights turn night into imitation day? Or are you somewhere quieter, perhaps under stars that seem older than time, where silence carries the weight of ancient oceans? Have you ever felt a moment stretch longer than it should? Quiet seconds when the air thickened and the world around you seemed painted in slow motion? That sensation, fleeting though it was, is what this chapter is about. Because time is not merely what ticks on a watch. Time is erosion working a mountain into sand one grain at a time. Time is isotope whispers in the chemistry of stone, marking the rise and fall of carbon, the breath of ancient seas still folded into shell and fossil. Time is memory written in geology, and memory, as we know, is never complete. Always some pieces are smoothed away, like shells rolled too long in the tide. Imagine standing on a Jurassic shoreline, the surf rolling not in minutes but in centuries. Each crashing wave carrying minerals, seed spores, dust from unseen volcanic tremors far inland. Above you, the sky is heavier, thicker with oxygen than today. You would inhale the air and find it richer, denser, as if the planet itself had chosen to feed its forests, its insects, its creatures of bone and scale. The Earth then was speaking in a deeper rhythm, one we can still trace in isotopes lodged in the teeth of fossils, in the oxygen locked within crystalline layers, in the quiet mathematics of decay. And yet, here is the mystery. If this day, this single cycle of light and shadow, could feel eternal, then what does that tell us about memory itself? Do we remember days, or does the planet remember them for us? Could it be that the very soil beneath our feet is keeping record? Not in words, not in ink, but in layers pressed silently against each other, epoch upon epoch? Does a cliff face overlooking the sea know more about time than any library of human history? Maybe it does. Maybe every fragment of stone that eroded into sand tonight has been on a journey longer than the lineage of our species. What if this is the closest the planet comes to speech? Not language, but stone. Not sound, but pattern. You and I may think of days as fragile, rising, falling, slipping away into the next. But the Earth remembers differently. A tree fallen in a Jurassic swamp became coal. A ripple preserved in mud became fossilized wave. Even shadow had weight here, and even silence survived. The day did not slip away. It was captured, buried, waiting for discovery hundreds of millions of years after the last heartbeat that witnessed it. And yet, if this much can be remembered, if this much can be held inside rock, how much more was lost? How many days vanished without trace? How many moments sank below subduction zones, recycled into magma, erased from memory forever? The Earth remembers, yes, but it forgets too. Its memory is not perfect. It is layered, broken, stitched together, interrupted. And in that imperfection lies a question for us, one that humbles and unsettles in equal measure. What happens to the days that vanish completely? Perhaps they are not truly gone. Perhaps memory isn't just physical but something more elusive, something carried in absence, in silence, in mystery itself. When we stare at a fossilized fern, we see more than a leaf pressed into stone. We sense the humid air that once touched it, the insects that once crawled across its surface, the cycles of light and shadow that made it grow. We imagine what we cannot see, and in doing so, perhaps the fossil remembers for us. And so the Jurassic day continues in our mind. A day that does not end. A day that folds into itself. A day recorded by rocks, winds, and oceans. A day that leads us into forests where oxygen was wealth, and plants ruled not merely as backdrop, but as empires in themselves. For if this long day could preserve so much in its silence, what else might the forests beneath its sky have whispered into the planet's memory? The forests of the Jurassic were not simply backdrops to the great creatures that walked beneath their canopies. They were the true architects of the air, the steady pulse of the planet's breathing. Every fern, every towering cycad and ginkgo, worked in quiet mathematics, capturing sunlight, splitting breath apart, and flooding the atmosphere with oxygen far denser than what you or I inhale today. To walk among them would have felt different, heavier somehow. A thickness of air that spoke of abundance, of life lived on a grander scale. These forests were a collective body, not just individual plants standing apart. Each trunk, each leaf, each root carried out a role in an orchestra of chemistry, feeding not only themselves but the world around them. You would have seen dragonflies with wingspans wider than your arm gliding across shafts of ancient light, their size permitted by the richness of this atmosphere, the forest's invisible gift. Beneath, the soil was a dark reservoir of memory, a place where every fallen frond, every decayed root, returned its material to the ground and waited, someday, to become coal. Science tells us that isotopes of carbon and oxygen, still held in stone and shell, are the whispers of those forests. They are the measure of the Earth's memory, a record etched in the smallest of particles, telling us how storms cycled, how climates tilted, how the lungs of the world rose and fell long before we ever named them. If we listen carefully, these signatures reveal more than just numbers, they show us balance. For these forests were not simple scenery but thermostats, holding steady the conditions in which reptiles grew vast, in which seas teemed with ammonites, in which air itself could carry life higher and lighter than it can today. And yet, forests are also storytellers of entropy. Every leaf that curled into the soil became part of a long equation. Decay leading to sediment, sediment pressed into stone. What lived as breath became memory. What shaded the earth became fuel for deep time. Perhaps every moment of shade on that Jurassic floor is still with us, compressed into black seams of coal far beneath our modern feet. A slow, silent time capsule of atmospheric generosity. But can forests truly be said to remember? Or is memory only our word for what their chemistry preserved? If the isotopes in their leaves carry stories still, then perhaps every tree was a witness, every root system a recorder of how the day stretched on. Maybe forests were the planet's memory at its most alive, breathing not in silence but in chorus, not in permanence but in endless cycles that built the architecture of skies. To imagine these forests is to stand in air that was less our own, yet more alive. To imagine their sound is to hear not birdsong alone but the ceaseless exhalation of breath, gas moving invisibly through the world, transforming stone, climate, and water all at once. There is a humility in this thought, that while dinosaurs rose into dominance, it was not they who held power, but the trees surrounding them, the ferns drifting in their shadow, the unspoken systems regulating the length of their reign. And maybe, if we listen closely, those forests have never truly gone silent. Their traces live in isotope lines, in coal seams, in the living cells of descendant plants that still breathe with us today. You could say that every breath we take carries a shadow of the Jurassic, that the air itself has passed through countless ancient forests before finding us. Forests remember, and because they remember, we continue. Yet what happens when memory like this fades? When fire consumes it, when industry breaks it down, when cycles that once held balance shift too quickly to repair? If forests once kept the world's breath, what becomes of us if they forget? The story of forests is also the story of fragility, of life dependent on a delicate dance of gas and light. And in that fragility lies the open question that waits patiently, like shade pooling in the understory. If the forests of the Jurassic could build an atmosphere thick with abundance, what new memory will the forests of our present leave for those who walk far after us? The edges of the Jurassic world were drawn not only by forests, but by the long, waiting line of the sea. To stand on those ancient shores was to witness a dialogue between land and water that spoke in measures far longer than any life could hold. The waves did not crash as they do in our ears today. They moved in centuries, advancing and receding with the patience of entire epochs. Even the sand beneath them was not simply sand, but fragments of shattered mountains, once lifted toward the heavens, now worn down into grains too small to count. Each particle was still writing its story, etched in mineral veins, whispering of rivers that carried it, of glaciers that ground it, of winds that sent it down to meet the sea. The coastline, then, was less a place and more a process. It was a script, carefully rewritten by every tide, reshaped by erosion, revised by storms, never complete and never final. If you had crouched to let the waves wash against your hands, you would have been touching moments far older than the day itself. Each shifting grain was not simple sediment, but deep time made visible. Igneous rocks broken open, continental plates eroded, giant river deltas faded into whispers. Science helps us understand this through the geology of subduction and uplift. Ocean floors grow heavy with sediment over millions of years, then slide beneath continental crusts, sinking into the mantle, remelting, erasing themselves into fire, and in their place new shorelines rise. Thus, even when we look upon Jurassic sands, we are not seeing permanence, but a pause in motion, a brief surface glimpse of cycles stretching across unfathomable scales. The planet's memory here feels almost liquid. But imagine the sounds, or what we might call sounds, of such a place. Not singular waves, but the cadence of centuries, stone into sand, sand into shore, shore into sea. Perhaps it would feel less like listening and more like being absorbed, as though the ocean's rhythm entered you, made you part of its geometry. For the ocean is not merely water but also archive. Its chemistry holding isotopes of every change, its currents carrying evidence of climates, its sediments protecting the fossils of creatures that never looked upon the land. Standing at that edge, one might wonder, what is the difference between memory and erosion? Is erosion simply forgetting, or is it the act of carrying memory forward, reshaping it, thinning it, layering it elsewhere? We may think of sand as loss, but perhaps it is the most enduring preservation. Mountains ground fine enough to outlast themselves, oceans dispersing fragments too light to decay. Nothing disappears. It only becomes smaller, more patient, more ubiquitous. And still, the shore itself would have felt alive. Small reptiles darting across tidal pools, crabs shaping burrows, the faint shimmer of mollusks pushing against the tide. Each left marks, plots of living memory pressed into mud, with some destined to fossilize, others vanished without trace. To walk there was to walk upon a palimpsest of presence. Signatures stacked upon signatures, most of them erased by the sea, but never fully gone. It is here, more than anywhere, that the metaphor of waiting feels strongest. The ocean waited with every tide. The shore waited with every grain. Together they stood in balance, each reshaping and destroying, each giving birth to whatever might eventually come. It leaves us with a quiet question that lingers, a question the waves seem always to be asking. If every grain of sand once belonged to a mountain, then what, in time, might we too become? And as the hours of that great Jurassic day pressed forward, the ocean did not simply remain at the edge, but began to shape the lands beyond. Because where there are shores, there are rivers, and where rivers carve paths inland, whole landscapes begin to remember themselves in motion. Beneath the ferns, beneath the slow paths of dinosaurs and the still patience of swamp and shore, another rhythm was always pulsing. A rhythm too deep for creatures to know, too vast for forests to silence. The earth, even in the calm of the Jurassic day, carried fire in its veins. Volcanoes do not keep our time. They follow older clocks, hidden beneath the crust, measured not in seconds or seasons but in balances of pressure and melt. To stand above them was to stand on steady ground that was never truly still, on plains that quietly swelled with heat, on mountains waiting for their next sentence of fire. Lava coursed in the hidden arteries of this ancient earth, molten rock rising slowly through fractures, spreading outward like thought, like breath. It was the deepest expression of the planet's memory. Not the memory written in forests or beaches, but a memory that lay further down, in the core of things. When a volcano rose and split the sky, it was both destruction and renewal in one. Ash would sweep across canopies, suffocating with silence. But minerals would fall back into soil, feeding it for centuries afterward, a dark nourishment gifted by violence. To imagine this is to sit with contradiction. Lava erases, but it also preserves. Ash kills forests but also seals them, fossilizing entire landscapes in hours, holding their shapes in impossible stillness until erosion reveals them millions of years later. Destruction writes its own quiet pages. Renewal hides in every burn. No human eye saw these Jurassic eruptions, yet the Earth remembered their rhythm anyway. We find it now in isotope traces, in the chemical signatures of rocks cooled too quickly, in the layers buried within layers of basaltic plains. All of it part of that endless planetary script, heat rising, cooling, waiting, and rising again. Science tells us this process is part of the cycle of plate tectonics. Oceanic crust, loaded with sediment and fossils, slides beneath continents, descending back into the mantle. There, it melts, the past recycled into magma, folded into the heat below. When it rises, it does not return unchanged. It comes back transformed, the memory of ancient seas and forests now molten, flowing, incandescent. What once lived in shallow bays becomes fire. What once shaded the land with fern canopy becomes stone. Then ash, then something entirely new. But listening to this deeper time, we might ask, is this obliteration, or is it another form of memory? Could the pulse of a volcano be the way Earth resets its own archive, burning pages so that new ones might be written? Maybe nothing is forgotten, not truly. Melted, reformed, re-expressed, yes, but gone? Perhaps not at all. In this way, even fire is patient. Picture it. A darkened horizon lit in sudden bloom, a plume rising higher than mountains, ash drifting for weeks across forests, across seas. Dinosaurs moving not with panic, but with instinctive withdrawal. Foliage silent under falling soot. And then quiet. The rivers choking with silt. The air heavy, years of winter seated by the sky. The clock of destruction ticking in silence. Yet even here, life goes on. Moss returns first, small shoots in the black. Then forests rise again, young and fresh, rooting in the very ash that killed their ancestors. In that moment, the pulse completes itself. The clock ticks forward, endlessly patient. For us, volcanoes evoke drama, sound, and fear. But for the Jurassic Earth, they were far too ordinary for such distinctions. They were simply another breath of the planet, another layer of its endless cycle. Like lungs inhaling, lungs exhaling, rock cooling, rock melting. What seemed catastrophe to a single day was, in deep time, only the steady rhythm of things as they had always been. The forests above never knew the fire below, yet they depended on it all the same. Perhaps this is what humbles us most. The realization that the ground beneath has always been alive, carrying clocks and songs beyond our scale. Our days are fragile, our years are fleeting, but Earth keeps its time in magma, in pressure, in the quiet circulation of unseen fire. And so, as the Jurassic day goes on, we leave the trembling pulse beneath, turning our gaze upward, where the skies themselves held their own empires, vast wings etched against the light, giants carried by the denser breath of the world. Above the forests, beyond the trembling veins of fire beneath the crust, the sky revealed its own kingdom. Here the air itself moved slowly, dense with oxygen rich enough to carry giants. And upon its pale canvas, pterosaurs traced their long, languid patterns, like drifting thoughts too immense to belong to a single mind. Their wings stretched not just across air, but across perception. An arc of living geometry, a reminder that the sky was never empty but always a domain waiting to be written upon. To imagine them is to imagine the horizon in motion. In the deep light of a Jurassic sun, their silhouettes crossed like shadows of ideas, pointing to both the freedom that height allows and the entropy that inevitably waits. Somehow, both truths lived in every beat of those wings. Pterosaurs moved with grace, yet their flight came at the cost of energy, of delicate balances between bone, air, and muscle. The more we look, the more we realize that every moment of flight was borrowed time, lent by a world that briefly permitted such vast forms. The sky itself was thick, its breath heavier, its lift more generous. And so wings could stretch longer, bodies could grow larger, possibilities expanded. Fossils tell us their bones were hollow, intricate lattices of strength and fragility, designed to hold the contradictions of existence. Power and lightness, endurance and demise. Each fossilized skeleton, pressed into stone, reads like a poem written in anatomy, unfolding questions about what it means to rise above the earth, and what gravity always asks in return. We may think of the sky as a void, but it was never void. It was currents, it was flow, it was the great invisible river through which these creatures swam. Their membranes of stretched skin caught the air not like sails catching wind, but more like thoughts catching silence. A glide, an apparition, a reminder of freedom's impermanence. Where forests were rooted, where volcanoes were tethered to stone, the sky was an empire of passing forms. And those who lived there were archivists not of earth or ash, but of movement itself. Yet even as they soared, entropy was already sketching their endings. Skulls grew heavy, energies leaned toward collapse. Entire species, magnificent in one age, vanished quietly in the sweep of the next. To witness their flight is to remember that beauty does not deny impermanence. Beauty is made of it. Perhaps that was the sky's greatest gift. Freedom not as permanent release, but as a fleeting grace, a memory that cannot remain, yet will not fully disappear. Standing on the ground, one might look upward and wonder, what did these giants perceive? Carried above forests and seas, did the horizon seem limitless, or did even there, at the height of light and lift, the world feel finite? Could they sense the cycles of air as we might sense oceans, knowing that flight itself was only a raft over something vast and unseen? It is hard not to imagine that in their drifting arcs, we glimpse something mirrored in ourselves. A desire to rise, to glimpse from above, to test the edges of our own small place in the great domain of time. And as their shadows lengthened across beaches and trees, the world turned slowly beneath them, carrying always toward another dusk, another night. For if the sky was a field of freedom, it was also an opening into questions deeper than air. Where rivers begin, where memory flows, where the patient march of water shapes the very ground they flew above. When the shadows of wings withdrew from the sky and the ground fell quiet again, attention returned to another movement, one more patient than air, more constant than fire. Rivers. In the Jurassic, every river was a sculptor. Each flowed not as a passing feature, but as a hand carving deep lines into the face of time. They wound through forests and plains, splitting stone, gathering sediment, tracing paths that were as old as mountains yet always being rewritten. To see a river then was to watch memory itself in motion, carrying the weight of all that had come before toward the waiting oceans. A river carries more than water, carries fragments. In every swirl of mud, in every pebble moved downstream, there was a story. The shell of a creature caught in its current, a splinter of volcanic rock eroded from far away, pollen shed from trees dissolving into its surface, carbon grains pulled from leaf and soil. Tiny pieces of life and earth swept forward, destined to settle in deltas where time would press them into stone. Each new deposit offered a layer, and each layer was a page in the slow-writing book of the planet's memory. Science tells us that isotopes trace these journeys. The balance of carbon or oxygen in ancient river sediments records shifts in climate, floods, and droughts. Even now, we read in their chemistry the signatures of forests rising, volcanoes breathing ash, and entire ecosystems leaning into collapse or renewal. Water became both messenger and archive, carrying invisible records forward, dissolving them into histories few would ever see until millions of years later, when stone revealed their faint signatures. Imagine standing by one of these rivers, your feet pressed into the moist sand of its bank. The sound would be familiar, yet fuller, both rush and silence, a rhythm as steady as breath. Dinosaurs bent low to drink, their reflection shivering in the current. Ferns and conifers reached their roots into its edge, giving back to the same water that fed them. Dragonfly wings skimmed tilting light, their shadows flickering on ripples. What appeared calm hid enormous patience. For what the river carried was more than life. It carried the raw material of futures not yet known. In time, what settled at the river's mouth could become fossils. A bone washed downstream, softened, buried in layers of silt, might harden into stone. A leaf pressed under sediment could become an imprint, delicate veins preserved more perfectly than memory itself. Rivers were, in this sense, not the end of things but their transformation, turning endings into beginnings, lives into fossils, moments into geology. But there is another question hidden in their current. If water never truly rests, if it flows and disappears into sea and then sky, does it ever remember the places it has touched? Perhaps not in the way we think of memory, but in cycles too vast for one lifetime to hold. A raindrop falls on a Jurassic mountain, becomes snow, melts into the river, slips into ocean, and then, millions of years later, perhaps returns again, through cloud to another land, another time. Memory here is not fixed but circular, looping endlessly, never arriving, never finished. It is easy, then, to imagine rivers as voices. They did not speak through words but through silt, through sediment, through the places they reshaped. They were songs, written not in notes but in flows, their verses carrying on long after the singers themselves were gone. They hummed of erosion, of distance, of a quiet inevitability. That all things eventually move, and all things eventually change form. And as we follow that current outward, imagining how many lifetimes and ages drifted within it, we approach a realization that stretches beyond the riverbanks. For just as waves shape shores, and just as currents weave through continents, there are vast waters even deeper, oceans where memory is older, thicker, and still less complete. The rivers were only beginnings, threads feeding into something immeasurable. And as the Jurassic day pressed on, the current gathered itself and surrendered always to the greater body. The oceans, where silence is not absence, and where memory takes on forms so large we can only guess at their meanings. As the rivers fed their silt into oceans, carrying the whispers of mountains in every grain, life above their banks carried on in quieter, more fleeting signatures. Forests stretched into shadow, canopies thick with cycads and ginkgos, while the soil below bore the weight of feet far larger than ours will ever know. Dinosaurs walked there, some moved with thunderous weight, others with precise silence, but all of them marked the earth in ways that went far beyond mere footprints. Each step was a question, pressed into the soil, a question of survival, of belonging, of the impermanence of everything we walk upon. The ground of the Jurassic forest was dark with fallen ferns, littered with cones, threads of fungi weaving unseen patterns below. Every stride left behind not only a print, but also a record of passing through a moment. Shapes in mud later washed away, imprints hardened into stone, trails hinting at relationships we can no longer fully read. Was this one a predator, quiet and observant, following the faint scent of prey? Was another herding its young, drawn along a winding corridor of trees where light rarely reached? Their presence was both intimate and unreachable, a narrative written in shadows, carried forward only in fragments we now call fossils. Paleontology gives us glimpses. The depth of a track can reveal weight, the spacing can whisper of pace or purpose, the very angle of a claw mark might suggest hesitation, or power, or sudden flight. But footprints are never voices, only echoes, partial and incomplete. Still, those echoes remind us that life is not measured only in longevity but in motion, in brief passages across the soils of time. The dinosaurs walked and then they were gone, and still the soil remembered, folding their steps into layers, keeping silence over their purpose. To walk through these forest paths in imagination is to feel the quiet weight of agency. Each creature made choices, perhaps to turn toward water, perhaps to wait in shadow, perhaps to move without reason at all. Survival, even for giants, came by navigating paths not so different from ours. Uncertainty, need, instinct, opportunity. We may think of their size as dominance, yet their survival was never guaranteed. The forest itself had agency too. Roots broke apart stone, plants rose and fell in seasonal rhythms, entire ecosystems shifting beneath the feet that walked above them. Who truly owned these paths, the walkers or the ground that erased them? And so, here among cycads, the lesson of impermanence reveals itself. Not because life was brief, but because what is left behind is always unfinished. Tracks filled with rain, collapsed, vanished. Bones decayed unless buried. Even great creatures, in their slow strength, left records more fragile than the forests they crossed. What remained was not permanence, but vulnerability shifted into new form. A fossil preserved by chance, a shadow pressed into stone by accident of flood or ash. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves moved by fossil tracks. They bring us face to face with vanished time. They show that existence, no matter how immense, is temporary, that every footprint is a message already in the act of fading. To stand before a fossilized track today is to bridge across 150 million years, to place our own fragile steps beside those that once tested the same earth, and to feel both smallness and connection. The forest paths of the Jurassic remind us that even the greatest beings pass into silence. Yet their passing lingers. Maybe the same is true for us. Perhaps the marks we leave, whether written, spoken, or pressed invisibly into the memory of others, are not truly gone but are woven into the fabric of time's repeating cycles. And as those creatures faded into shadow, their tracks slowly filled with rain, roots, and silt, life above them went on unbothered. The path never waited for anyone passing. It simply rewrote itself, pathway upon pathway, silence upon silence. And still each trail ended somewhere. Not in the forest, not in the river, but toward the greater silence of the sea, where the footsteps of land met the vast domain of water. Toward the waiting oceans, where memory was preserved not in footprints, but in shells, fossils, and salt. Beyond the shadows of cycads, where the weight of footsteps faded into the earth, the world opened to a horizon without edges. The oceans. To approach them in the Jurassic was to arrive at a different kind of silence. Not empty, not still, but layered, filled with movements and voices unseen. The seas did not keep quiet. They spoke in ammonites drifting through clear shallows, in schools of fish trembling like living silver, in the low arcs of reptilian predators slicing through depths. Every current was part of a conversation that had already been going on for millions of years, and every tide carried forward a memory older than mountains. Salt water contained more than life. It contained the logic of cycles. Evaporation to cloud, cloud to rain, rain to river, river to sea, always returning to itself. No matter how far a drop traveled, it eventually came back, as if the ocean was not just body but mind, collecting and dispersing, forgetting and remembering in equal measure. Perhaps this is the oldest rhythm we know, the cycling of water, writing endlessly with no final page. To watch the tide on a Jurassic morning was to watch the planet breathe. Ammonites tell this story most clearly. Their spiral shells, perfect as galaxies turned inward, reveal not only beauty but a code, chambers filled and emptied, a design balancing pressure, buoyancy, and growth. Each tiny wall within those shells is a record of life adjusting to change, of organisms finding ways to persist. When we see them fossilized in cliffs or riverbeds today, we are not just seeing sea creatures. We are seeing the mathematics of adaptation, the persistence of survival inscribed in stone. But oceans carried darker voices too. Predators ruled, their skeletons fossilized with jaws still agape. Reminders that life often feeds by ending other lives. The ichthyosaurs, moving like echoes of dolphins before dolphins, chased fish with eyes as wide as lanterns. Pliosaurs, massive jaws threaded with teeth, drifted through the currents like shadows cast by fear itself. Yet even this was cycle. For every predator was also prey in waiting. Every death a transference of energy. Every body eventually sediment. Fuel for the silence to come. If one could stand upon a Jurassic cliff and look out, the ocean would have seemed both eternal and unknowable, patient yet dangerous. Its waters shimmered with chemical complexity that we can still measure now in isotope ratios embedded in shells and mineral layers. These isotopes whisper of warmth in some eras and chilling drops in others, of carbon heavy in the skies, of cycles that rose and fell with devastating consequence. It is humbling to realize that long before we named climate change, the ocean was already writing its chronicles of imbalance and return. Every surge and retreat is recorded, not in books but in stone. And still, the ocean was not a place of despair. It was abundance. Coral reefs rose in quiet empires, building themselves through accretion, skeleton by skeleton, until whole underwater cities of calcium held the light. Shoals of fish vanished and reappeared like living fractals, shifting forms that no one could contain. Even the silence beneath waves was vibrant, filled with soundless exchanges of movement, of life interlacing with life. The stillness we imagine was crowded, noisy in its own ways, a multitude woven into silence that was never empty but profoundly full. If rivers were memory in motion, then the sea was memory in depth. It did not move toward one destination but turned endlessly into itself, building layers of time upon its floor. Fossil beds grew thick, ammonite shells gathering like fallen leaves, whole skeletons resting side by side in silt. Over millions of years, pressure transformed them, rock layering over rock, until the sea's voices became indistinguishable from the stone it pressed into us. Even predators, even giants, joined the chorus of quiet, their deaths becoming continuity. And here we return to a thought that haunts. If the ocean remembers everything, then in what language does it keep those memories? Not syllables, not songs of air, but chemistry and curve, isotope and fossil. A language we can only partly learn, one with grammar too large, too strange for us to master. Still, even in fragments, we read pieces of its story, and the recognition humbles us. The same currents that carried ammonites and ichthyosaurs still move now, bearing our ships, our reflections, our fears. The same salt that washed over Jurassic shores still runs in our own blood. Perhaps there is no division at all. The ocean does not only hold life, it is life. And yet, in every cycle there is a dusk. Just as the skies once dimmed to wings and shadows, the seas too carried endings. Entire species vanished into their depths, recorded in fossils never found, their voices silent. What remains is only suggestion, imperfect, partial. Perhaps that is the greater truth of the ocean, that memory is never whole, and silence is never complete. The ocean without silence reminds us that nothing is ever still, even when it seems so. It compels us to pause, to ask, what else rests in the layers we have not yet uncovered? What else waits beneath the tides, folded not only in rock, but in the patience of water itself? And as the sun fell low across the Jurassic horizon, light slipping away from waves that continued on without end, the focus slowly turned back to the deeper ledger of time. The archives hidden not upon the surface, but within the elements themselves, where isotopes and decay recorded the most subtle rhythms of climate and change. If the oceans carried voices too vast for us to fully hear, then it is in their chemistry that whispers remain most faithfully. Beneath the shimmer of waves, in shells and sediments pressed layer upon layer, ancient signatures wait. They are not written in language as we know it, nor preserved in images, but in atoms, minute balances quietly marking the rise of temperature, the fall of forests, the rhythm of cycles that otherwise would have faded into silence. These are the isotopes, the hidden clocks of time. Carbon and oxygen, the elements so common in our air, our bodies, our seas, are also the scribes of Earth's memory. Within every fossil shell of an ammonite, within every layer of limestone at the sea's floor, their ratio tells a story. Oxygen isotopes speak of warmth and cold, of climatic shifts carried in the breath of oceans. A heavier fraction means cooler eras, more ice held in polar silence. A lighter one signals warmth, melt, and ocean expansion. Carbon traces another rhythm, recording forests as they grew and fell, marking the exchange of life into air, of air into soil, and of soil into water. Together, these isotopes compose diaries that outlast all words, diaries written invisibly in stone, patient as deep time itself. Science allows us to read these signatures much like listening to echoes in a canyon. When we analyze the carbonate in Jurassic shells, we are listening to seas long vanished, seas that once carried ammonites, ichthyosaurs, shoals of ancient fish beneath blazing suns or dimmer skies. The ratios reveal warm oceans sprawling wide, changes in circulation, moments when atmospheres shifted subtly yet profoundly. These tiny atomic differences preserve the rise and fall of entire climates in silence, telling not just of extinction events vast and violent, but also of the small, gradual shifts that shaped ecosystems long before any single cataclysm arrived. And yet these clocks do not tick at our pace. They are not seconds or minutes. They are cycles stretched across millions of years, so long that human time cannot truly grasp their motion. To us, they appear as frozen values in stone. But to the earth, they are fluid, flowing, always moving, always recombining, always eroding into the next. Memory is never fixed. It breathes, decays, reforms, and writes itself anew. Perhaps this is the hidden beauty of isotopes. They remind us that even silence is alive with unseen movement. Imagine standing in a Jurassic Valley, looking up at a sky thick with ancient air, not knowing that within every breath exchanged between forest and ocean, atoms were shifting. Invisible small changes encoding the weather of the day, the season, the age. Dinosaurs carried these atoms, plants returned them, rivers gathered them, and seas absorbed them. Each exchange, imperceptible, became testimony. What no creature could consciously remember was recorded anyway. Perhaps the planet remembers not by choice, but by chemistry. Perhaps its memory is unconscious, continuous, and immune to forgetting, until, at last, we stumble upon its archive. It humbles us to realize that we, too, carry isotopes that will one day serve this same role. The bones we leave, the soils we shape, the fires we burn, all alter carbon and oxygen ratios, pressing into the record. The clock of isotopes is impartial. It does not distinguish ammonite from human, fern from factory. Keeps time for all, silent, enduring, never hurried, never forgiving. But a question remains, one that drifts like a shadow across the beauty of this invisible clock. If the Earth remembers through isotopes, how much does it forget? Some layers erode. Some replace others. Plates subduct and cycle rock into fire, rewriting what once was written. What appears as permanence may in truth be a fragment preserved by chance. The isotopic record stretches vast, but is still full of gaps, absences, strange pauses. What entire ages have slipped past us, dissolved, unmarked, returned to magma. This thought unsettles softly, yet it is necessary. For memory, even at the level of atoms, is never whole. Gaps are part of the record. Silence is part of the archive. And it is in those silences, those countless unread passages, that mystery quietly survives, always beyond our reach, always pulling us further into wonder. Perhaps that is the true gift of isotopes. Not that they explain everything, but that they allow us to glimpse something eternal, something flowing just beneath perception. Their hidden clocks remind us that time is vast, that memory is incomplete, and that even in absence, something is always carried forward. And as the day lengthens, as volcanic breaths and forest shadows give way again to winds drawn across plains, we are reminded that even the air itself carries dust. Fine fragments once mountain, once storm. Dust that, like isotopes, is also memory in motion, drifting silence that will one day settle. Wind was the unseen traveler of the Jurassic world, moving endlessly across plains and valleys, over rivers and forests, through canyons freshly carved by water and time. It was a patient sculptor and a messenger, invisible save for the trails it stirred, the ripple of leaves, the smooth curves of dunes, the fine haze it carried. And within it, unseen, drifted the smallest of archives. Dust. Grains so light that they seemed weightless, yet carrying within them whole histories, each a fragment of stone or soil, once mountain, then collapsed, then carried onward in silence. Dust is rarely noticed in its moment, but it is constant, always present at the edges of sight. In the Jurassic, every speck was more than residue. It was memory in motion. One grain might have broken centuries earlier from a volcanic face, weathered by rain, ground by the sliding of roots. Another might have been drawn from floodplain soil, lifted in sudden gusts during a long dry season. Together, these particles whispered a truth perhaps greater than any forest or ocean, that nothing ever remains as it is. All things become smaller, lighter, erased not by absence but by dispersal. and so dust carried both death and renewal. What eroded from mountain peaks found new purpose on distant plains, settling across young roots that drew minerals upward again into leaves. Ash flung high by volcanic eruptions dimmed skies, but also enriched soils for centuries after. Each storm of dust marked an ending, but endings were always beginnings too. The particles never ceased their journey. They folded back into life, into soil, into stone, into the slow-turning wheel of deep time. Science tells us that even today, dust connects continents. In our present world, winds carry fine desert soils across entire oceans, feeding forests thousands of miles away. The same must have been true then. Oceans and continents in their Jurassic arrangement traded elements invisibly. What we imagine as still landscapes were, in truth, in constant exchange, their breath shared across the globe on dust unseen yet essential. In this way, the Jurassic Earth was already global in memory, bound together not by roads or speech but by the smallest fragments riding on invisible currents. To walk a Jurassic plain under steady wind would have been to walk among memories too small to see. The smell of dust, the faint sting of sand against the skin, the haze softening distance. All of it a reminder that the ground itself was never fixed, always leaving pieces of itself behind, traveling on elsewhere. You might notice dust settled in pools of still water, a faint trace across the surface, waiting to sink into layers, waiting to become sediment. Perhaps, millions of years later, those same grains, once mountain, once air, were pressed into stone. The trace of a storm no creature remained alive to recall. Yet we can still read dust today. In the deep cores drilled from ancient ice, particles rest in delicate layers, frozen stories of climates long gone. Saharan dust, volcanic dust, forest-borne dust, all fossilized into thin seams, silent witnesses of wind and storm. They show us droughts, mass deaths, fertile bursts of regrowth, extinction events. They remind us that even air carries records, no less enduring than stone. But there is also something profoundly human in dust. Every culture has turned it into metaphor. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Not because of its fragility, but because of its inevitability. Everything becomes dust in time. Buildings collapse, bones crumble, mountains erode, and still none of it is lost. What seems disappearance is only transformation, scattering, a kind of memory written as dispersal rather than preservation. So when we think of forgotten storms, when we imagine the uncountable winds that swept across the Jurassic Earth, we might ask, what storms have vanished without record, and what grains do we already unknowingly breathe? Could the particles that pass through us now once have rested in the shadow of a Jurassic fern? Could a mote of dust falling today from the air above your head contain within it some trace, however small, of a time when ammonites ruled beneath the oceans and pterosaurs drifted silently overhead? The thought is unsettling, yet strangely comforting, for it points to the fact that nothing is truly separate, that eras fold into one another, carried invisibly on winds that never rest. To live in dust is to live in connection, not because dust endures unchanged, but because it never stops moving, binding death to renewal, past to present, and present into the future. And as the Jurassic winds carried dust onward into new corners of the world, the shadows lengthened on the plain. It was in these shadows that another rhythm moved, eyes watching, limbs ready, predators marking the hours not in isotopes or storms, but in hunger. The hour of the hunters awaited in silence. As the winds carried dust across the plains, the forests sank toward an evening silence. And with the drifting quiet came another rhythm, the careful, deliberate cadence of predators. The hour of their presence was not bound to clocks but to instinct, to the hunger that dictated when to move, when to wait, when to strike. In the Jurassic, time itself was measured not by minutes or seasons but by need. And for predators, that need was eternal. In shadow and quiet, bodies crouched low, eyes catching even the smallest tremor of light, nostrils widened to the scent of movement through brush. For the hunter, each breath was calculation. The forests were not only trees and rivers but stages, and upon them predators gauged their moments with patience far beyond our own. Hunger taught them the shape of time, stretching it thin during hours of waiting, collapsing it into a single strike, a burst of motion when legs and jaws found their chance. Through them, life reminded itself of its own cycles, life feeding on life. A predator's chase was not cruelty but continuity, energy flowing onward, carried forward from fallen bodies into the sinew of another. Teeth tore, bones cracked, and yet something endured, always passed along, remembered not in sorrow but in matter itself. In this way, the hour of predators was also a memory, an echo written in flesh that carried far beyond the chase. We find this truth in fossils. The teeth of theropods still hold micro-scratches that speak of meals long forgotten. Bones reveal punctures, healed or fatal, marks of encounters that once shook the forests but are now silenced forever. Coprolites, fossilized remains of digestion, carry within them fragments of prey, seeds of vegetation, scales of fish. Here, too, hunger has left a geology of evidence. Even consumption, perhaps the most fleeting act of all, becomes part of the Earth's memory when pressed deep into layers of stone. But hunters did not roam only as solitary shadows. Some likely hunted in groups, movements coordinated by instinct and practice, the soundless ballet of survival learned across generations. Imagine them in the half-light, bodies moving together beneath the dense canopy, anticipating not only the chase but the chase beyond, the cycle of feeding that would sustain their young, the continuation of their lineage held within each shared breath. The group, like the individual, followed hunger's rhythm, and in doing so etched patterns of behavior that, even faintly, we can still see today echoed in modern creatures. Hunger, then, was more than need, it was time itself, for it returned always. No kill lasted forever. No satisfaction endured beyond days. Always hunger re-emerged, calling predators back into alertness, back into shadows, back into the hour where life and death hung in delicate balance. To live in the Jurassic as a predator was to know intimately the impermanence of things. Silence first, motion next, silence again. And yet, the prey defined them as much as the hunt did. Herds of plant-eaters, enormous and steady, moved across valleys like ancient tides, their bodies shaping predator behavior, their migrations dictating when and where hunger could be answered. Carnivore and herbivore were bound together, a dance of survival that neither would ever escape. Without prey, the hunter perished. Without the hunter, herds grew imbalanced. Forests reshaped too quickly. Both roles formed the ecology of time, both pressing their marks into memory. But there is a deeper wonder here. If hunger was the clock of predators, then perhaps hunger is also the great link tying all life together, across eons, across extinctions. From single-celled organisms to giants of scale and tooth, every being has sought energy beyond itself. Perhaps every chase, every feeding, every exchange of life into life is one continuous narrative, an unbroken cycle that stretches from the first cells in the ocean to us, here and now. We measure time by sun and moon, but perhaps nature measures it by hunger fulfilled, hunger waiting, and hunger renewed. Still, these hours leave us with questions. What memories were pressed into those fleeting hunts? Did the predator sense permanence in victory, or only the fleeting relief of another night survived? Was time, for them, always sharper in the chase, always collapsing into the silence of jaws? And how much of this story remains hidden, lost in the storms of erosion, in the floods of rivers, in the countless unpreserved hunts where nothing fossilized, nothing was retained? We are left with fragments, teeth, bones, coprolites. Yet even these whisper enough to remind us that survival was written into the pulse of the age. Predators, more than any other life, made time visible in motion. Not gentle cycles like isotopes, not patient flows like rivers, but sudden, urgent bursts where life rearranged itself. They were the clocks of violence, but also of renewal. And when we look back, when we bring their fossils to light, we are not just learning about them, we are glimpsing the relentless pace of time itself. The hour of predators always ended. Every shadow, every hunt, every chase was temporary. Hunger returned, cycles reset, new days rose over plains washed quiet by dust and wind. And as the light shifted once more across that long Jurassic day, life did not freeze. but transformed. The still waters of the sea awaited, where predators of a different kind built empires not with speed or teeth, but with architecture, with coral, with colonies that grew slowly upward toward the sun. After shadows and jaws wrote their fleeting chapters upon the land, the oceans once again reminded the earth of another kind of persistence. A persistence not defined by speed or violence, but by patience. Far below the surface, where light filtered in long streams through blue water, reefs were growing. They were not fast nor dramatic, yet over centuries, and then millennia, they built something more enduring than a predator's hunt could ever leave behind. They built empires, coral cities of the Jurassic Sea. At first glance, a reef seems quiet, an unbroken wall of color and stone. But look closer, and every inch is alive. Tiny organisms, too small to see with the naked eye, labored endlessly, secreting calcium carbonate, building chamber upon chamber, colony upon colony. One layer rose, then another grew upon it, until whole structures stood like underwater cathedrals. These reefs were more than habitats. They were memory itself, archives of light and mineral that captured entire ages in their walls. The corals lived symbiotically with algae, exchanging energy, balancing needs, weaving a harmony that allowed entire ecosystems to bloom. Schools of fish darted between their crevices, ammonites traced slow spirals nearby, crustaceans scuttled within shadows, predators hovered in patience above. Every life form touched the reef, whether as resident, visitor, or hunter, and as they did, their traces folded into its growth. Scales, shells, detritus pressed into the calcium, hidden in the scaffolding of patience. Science tells us that these reefs preserve chemical signals. The ratio of isotopes within their carbonate skeletons record seawater temperatures, shifts in chemistry, the slow cycling of oceans through warm and cool phases. In these colonies, we hear echoes of ancient oceans warming, of salinity rising or falling, of climates tilting into new equilibria. Reefs are books written not in words but in chemistry and form, each polyp a letter, each layer a sentence, each wall a chapter. They endure even when great predators vanish. They remember even when whole eras are forgotten. But reefs, for all their splendor, were never immune to entropy. Storms broke their outer edges. Earthquakes shifted them downward. Volcanic ash clouded the waters that fed their algae. Entire reef systems sometimes vanished, struck down by climate swings or dissolved in acidifying seas. And yet, just as quickly, life would begin to layer again, patient as before, building upward toward the light. In this way, each reef embodied not permanence, but resilience, the quiet certainty of beginning again. Imagine drifting through a Jurassic reef, the water warmer than today, colors bending through light as it fractured on delicate corals. You would see arches of mineral overgrown with sea fans and sponges, ammonites sheltering in niches, fish shimmering like fractured rainbows, predators lurking just beyond, waiting for weak or unwary forms. Yet beyond the motion, beyond the flash of fins or the sudden dart of life, there would be a stillness born from growth too slow for the eye to see, structures constantly building beneath the immediacy of daily struggle. We can still walk through the remnants of those reefs today, not beneath water but upon dry land. Lifted by time, cut through by erosion, they rise like cliffs of pale stone, filled with fossil corals that once gathered sunlight beneath ancient seas. To press your hand to limestone is to press against a reef that once sheltered predators and prey alike, a reef that once hummed with the slow voice of countless colonies. These cities, fossilized, remind us again that memory is everywhere, that even the smallest organism has its place in the planet's architecture of remembrance. And yet, how much was lost? How many reefs vanished fully, broken by tectonic subduction, erased in the furnace of the mantle, leaving no trace but the absence itself? We see fragments enough to shape stories, but we will never know the fullness of their splendor. Memory, even here, is partial. The archive is grand, yet incomplete. Still, there is comfort in that incompleteness. Reefs remind us that permanence is not the measure of meaning. Meaning is found in layering, in repetition, in cycles of life, leaving behind structures that others depend upon. Their empires were not ruled by kings or predators, but by patience, quiet, ceaseless patience. And though many were broken, others rose again. That is perhaps the truest legacy of the Jurassic reefs. That life reshapes its ruins, and every collapse is also an invitation for renewal. As the long day over the Jurassic Sea continued, the reefs thrived unseen, each colony holding fragments of age and cycle. But near their edge, where sediment gathered and life turned to stone, the quiet work of memory deepened still further. For here, at the threshold between biology and rock, the most enduring preservation began: fossilization, the transformation of life itself into stone. At the edges of reefs, in the basins of rivers, upon forest floors where creatures fell and did not rise again, another process of memory began to unfold, one slower than growth, slower even than erosion. Fossilization. If reefs were archives of light and mineral, then fossils were the portraits of time itself. Slow photographs the earth took without intention, preserving not only form but silence, not only structure but the shadows of vanished movement. To fossilize is to transform, to pass from breath into monument. Tendons dissolve, cells collapse, yet minerals seep in to replace them, preserving the architecture of what once lived. A leaf pressed against wet clay, a shell buried under layers of sand, a bone encased in silt. All of these, given patience beyond comprehension, hardened into stone. And in that transformation, the living became record. What once walked, swam, grew, or rested became both memory and monument. A creature once defined by breath became something else, a witness. Fossils are not complete stories. They are fragments, blurred photographs, sometimes missing entire parts. Yet within them is detail that astonishes. The serration along a tooth, the delicate veins of a fern, the ripple marks on a fish's fin, all carried forward as if the moment refused to let go entirely. The planet does not remember with precision, but with patience. Enough stays for us to imagine the whole. The rest vanishes, asking us to wonder what filled the spaces in between. Science shows us how these processes occur. Fossils form when sediments bury remains quickly, isolating them from decay. Groundwater flows, carrying minerals into the tiniest cellular spaces, replacing organic matter one particle at a time. Over millennia, the shape and structure remain, though substance itself has changed. Stone takes the place of life, but the pattern is preserved. In this way, fossils are paradoxes, both absence and presence, both erasure and persistence. They show us that forgetting and remembering are not opposites but are interwoven into the same process. Imagine standing beside a fossil bed in the Jurassic, long before erosion would reveal it. Beneath your feet lie countless bodies hidden in silence. Ammonites with spiral shells pressed flat, fish preserving the lines of their scales. Even the impression of soft tissues quickly buried in ash or floodplain mud. Entire moments of death, disaster, or stillness. Captured, sealed, and left in darkness for millions of years. No witness above the ground would ever know. And yet those hidden impressions waited, holding form long past the creatures themselves, waiting to surface again under different skies, for eyes that did not yet exist. What does it mean, then, for a movement to freeze forever? A dinosaur lifting its foot, caught mid-step as mud hardened, becomes not an action but an eternal gesture. A fern leaf, fallen carelessly upon silt, becomes not decay but an enduring fossil, its veins more perfectly preserved than in any living specimen. Time, ordinarily fluid, turns suddenly into permanence. But fossils remind us, permanence is not infinite. They too erode, fracture, weather away. They too are forgetful in time's endless erosion. Even stone photographs fade, and yet we are captivated by them. Perhaps because fossils speak to something deeply human, the desire to hold what would otherwise be lost. They are our assurance that life does not vanish entirely, that even silence leaves echoes. When we hold a trilobite pressed into slate, or trace with our fingers the spiral of an ammonite, we are engaging in memory older than memory itself. We are touching what time could not erase, even as it erased everything else around it. Every fossil is a paradox, the presence of what is gone, the absence that still speaks. They ask strange questions. Does a fossil remember the creature it once was? Was memory ever in the stone? Or do we create memory when we find it, when we give the fossil its meaning? Perhaps both are true. The planet may not intend remembrance, and yet, through fossilization, memory insists itself into matter, waiting to be read. We may dream of permanence, yet fossils caution against it. For what we receive are fragments, glimpses. Most life does not fossilize. Most forms vanish fully, recycled into soil, dissolved into oceans, drawn downward by tectonic fire. What we see are accidents of preservation, precious accidents that stand for countless untold lives. Fossils remember only partially. They allow us vision, but they also guard their secrets, forcing us to imagine all that is forever forgotten. Even so, in their quiet presence, fossils persist as the most delicate monuments we have, stones that let us sense shadowed forms of deep time. They are proof that memory exists not only in minds but in matter, not only in language but in chemistry and chance. Fossils remind us that life leaves traces, even in silence, even in stone. And as the Jurassic day lengthened further, as the oceans and forests continued their vast cycles, the empire of plants grew with a quiet dominance of their own. Fossils may freeze moments, but it was the ferns and their kin, living and multiplying, that defined entire landscapes. Their green empires breathed life into an atmosphere still thick with their presence, a dominion soft yet unchallenged. While fossils preserved the memory of what was gone, it was the plants that surrounded those moments with continuity, empires not fossilized but living. In the Jurassic, ferns and cycads, ginkgos and conifers, ruled in silence. They were nations spread across valleys and slopes, kingdoms of green whose borders were not drawn by stone walls but by shadow and canopy. Their dominion was not loud. They did not conquer through force or teeth, but through patience, through roots that broke soil, through leaves that converted light into breath. Everywhere one looked, the empire of plants held sway. To stand in such a forest was to stand beneath a ceiling of green, where oxygen flowed in thicker richness than today, where spores floated like invisible dust, where shade cooled the ground enough for new cycles of life to anchor themselves. This was power, diffuse, quiet, relentless. The plants shaped atmosphere, filled rivers with silt, built soil over stone, and in doing so defined the boundaries of every other being's survival. Predators and prey, great and small, depended upon the balance struck in these canopies. They were the stage upon which every other drama unfolded. Science reminds us that vast forests of ferns contribute to climate not only by taking in carbon but by storing it, drawing cycles downward into soil, locking them into sediments that, in time, may become coal. In the Jurassic, these processes ran on immense scales. The very air was thickened by their work, supporting insect giants and giving flight to forms impossible in thinner atmospheres. When we trace carbon isotopes today, we can still read the echoes of those forests' dominion. Their respiration, their decline, their renewal written into elemental signatures carried forward across epochs. Yet their empire was not truly permanent. Fires swept through, lightning kindled destruction, floods tore at roots, volcanic ash buried whole valleys. And still plants returned. The fern in particular has always been an emblem of resilience. After disaster, eruption, asteroid impact, collapse, the first green often to reappear is fern. Its spores drift too small to notice, yet carried on wind, they land, they grow, they colonize, and within years once bare ground becomes forested again. Perhaps this is what empire means when written by plants. Not unbreakable dominance, but unending return. Imagine walking among these Jurassic ferns as the sun angled through. The air would be saturated, humid, thick with the smell of resin and the breath of countless leaves. Every surface was layered with life. Moss upon bark, vines upon conifers, cycads with fronds unfurling like living spirals. Each path invited awe, yet also reminded any traveler of scale, that no creature, no footprint, no single presence had greater say than the quiet dominion of leaves. Dinosaurs themselves moved as dependents here, their size nothing against the patience of forests that would outlast them. Plants do not remember in fossils alone. They remember in the air. The oxygen we breathe carries remnants of ancient dominions. Each inhalation is shared not just with the plants of today but with distant generations that reshaped atmosphere countless times. To breathe is to participate in their empire, long after their spores have settled and their trunks eroded back into soil. Perhaps that is their truest monument, not preserved in stone but written directly into us. And yet, the empire of plants asks questions too. If they could thrive and fall without names, without witnesses, what does that say about our role within their lineage? They forgot us before we ever arrived, and they will likely forget us again. Their memory of us, if it exists, will not be in recognition but in chemistry, in the adjustments of carbon and oxygen, in isotopes of our activities folded into their leaves. From their perspective, we are less empire and more weather, temporary, passing, absorbed. As the Jurassic day moved forward beneath their canopies, plants continued their quiet rule. They asked nothing but cycles, and yet everything depended on their cycles. Theirs was not dominance in sound or spectacle, but in the continuous hum of photosynthesis, in the balance of gases, in the stability they quietly upheld, and in the silence beneath their canopies, where light fell in dappled fragments and the air grew still. Another truth lingered, not the empire's abundance, but the fragile spaces between each breath of life. For even in such dominion, there was always room for stillness. After the long dominion of plants, after the shadow and weight of immense bodies moving through forests and plains, there came moments when all seemed still. No footsteps, no wings, no chase across the undergrowth. The air hung heavy, humid, and warm. And yet, silence in the Jurassic was never truly empty. Beneath the hush of leaves, within the soil underfoot, and carried in the very air itself, life and time continued. So small, so patient, so unacknowledged that to notice it required more stillness than any giant creature might give. When nothing walked, the ground itself lived. Microbes swarmed invisibly, breaking down fallen fronds, cycling nutrients back into soil. Fungi stretched their filaments into the damp, returning minerals into circulation. Invisible interactions, chemical dances between nitrogen and carbon, oxygen and hydrogen, layered themselves into the air and root systems. To the forest it seemed silence, but underneath it was continuity. Life enacted its slow motion, building balance, holding breath, waiting for larger forms to appear again. Silence was never absence. It was transition. Energy moved, transforming as it always had, through decay, through the fine threads of entropy stretching forward. Entropy does not wait for footfalls or storms. It works in silence, quietly undoing order, unthreading structures, preparing all things for dispersal. The fallen trunk softened into moss. The bone hidden beneath soil dissolved into mineral trace. The air itself rearranged molecules in endless drift. In silence, the arrows of time are clearest. And so the silence between heartbeats was not stillness, but the space where transformation revealed itself. Perhaps it was the most honest rhythm of all. Not the roar of volcanoes, not the call of predators, not even the rush of tides, but the quiet correction that ensures everything dissolves and rejoins cycles beyond perception. We can measure it in chemistry, gases adjusting, isotopes shifting, minerals recombining. But the sensation of it is far older, far deeper. It is felt more than seen, known more than witnessed. Imagine yourself seated against the roots of a giant cycad, hearing no cry, no motion, only the weight of still air pressing against skin. The forest seems paused, yet beneath, a colony of microbes consumes what has fallen, releasing invisible currents back into soil and sky. Insects tick small hidden rhythms. Ferns adjust their fronds to the faint bending of light. A silence filled with invisible activity, the quiet continuation that persists whether marked or not. The pause is only in perception. The heartbeat of the world never stops. Perhaps this is why such moments feel profound, because they remind us that our senses are shallow, that what we perceive as absence is only the limit of hearing or sight. Beneath silence is persistence. Beneath stillness is change, and still entropy waits, not in sound, but in inevitability. Each heartbeat is followed by the pause, and each pause is the threshold from which the next begins. Earth is no different. Every pause between great eruptions, between extinctions, between ages, is filled with unseen recalibrations, adjustments too small to see but vast enough to change everything that follows. Even the air itself, still and heavy, was a living chemistry. Oxygen given by forests, carbon rising from soil, nitrogen moving invisibly. The balance of gases shifted endlessly, a long conversation with no voice but the language of molecules. A dialogue between atmosphere and plant, volcano and ocean, not quiet in its meaning but soundless in its exchange. Perhaps silence is only the illusion we perceive when we are not attuned to such pace. So, in the pauses of the Jurassic world, when no creature stirred, entire systems carried on their patient designs. The silence between heartbeats became as important as the heartbeats themselves. Each pause a space where possibility stretched open, where entropy continued to knit and unknit. It humbles us. That so much of life's story is told in places too small to see, in moments too quiet to hear. And as day tilted further down, with stillness heavy between movements, silence carried us into the longer hours of light, hours where the sun itself felt suspended, lingering in its long arcs, shaping landscapes with shadows that stretched wider than any creature, longer than any day we know. The silence beneath the canopy gave way at last to light, rising not in haste but in a motion as steady as the forests themselves. The sun of the Jurassic world was the same star we know today, yet the earth it touched carried a different breath, a different balance. Its rays passed through an atmosphere thicker with oxygen and carbon, scattering in ways unfamiliar to our modern skies. Colors bent differently, and shadows stretched not merely as hours passed, but as if time itself dilated under the weight of that ancient air. A day of long light is not measured as we measure our days now. Each hour seemed to linger, each shadow to pause in its descent. The arcs of sunlight moved slower, merging with the rhythms of forests, rivers, and seas. It created a sensation not of urgency but of endurance, as if the day could carry on indefinitely, suspended between brightness and dusk. It was a rhythm not human, never aligned with our clocks, but deeply Jurassic, written in scales too broad for us to feel except through imagination and the records left behind. Across the plains, that long light drew shapes across cycads and conifers, stretching their shadows like soft brushstrokes across soil. Dinosaurs moved through the golden hush, their forms lengthened and distorted on the ground, part creature, part darkness. For them, the day's rhythm was survival, but the light itself was indifferent, falling equally on predator and prey, fern and stone. To the earth, light was not selective. It was abundance. Science tells us that slight differences in Earth's spin and orbit carried subtle effects in deep time. Precession, axial tilt, orbital shape, each changed the length and quality of days over millions of years. The Jurassic day, though not vastly longer than ours, carried light into environments vastly altered. Air thickened with oxygen, humidity high, skies dense with moisture and particles. This density bent light, softened distances, and made every horizon a little more blurred, a little more dreamlike in its haze. Even in reality, the light of that time must have seemed uncanny. But beyond the science lies another truth. Light is memory. What we see is always the past, photons taking time to reach us. In the Jurassic, each beam of sunlight lit creatures and landscapes now gone, carrying their images outward into space, endlessly traveling. Those photons are still moving, still carrying pictures of ammonite shells, fern shadows, rivers winding through plains. Somewhere, far beyond any place we will ever go, the light of that Jurassic day may continue, bearing scenes into the dark. A long day, remembered by a universe indifferent to who or what once walked here. To imagine the stillness within such light is to imagine a world waiting without impatience. Shadows stretched into valleys, reflections glistened on slow rivers, insects shimmered against beams that illuminated particles of dust in suspension. The air in forests seemed to hold the light, as if it lingered in suspension before finally dimming into dusk. This unhurried pace created the sense that night might never come, that the sun could remain above the horizon for as long as life itself needed. And yet all things end. Even in their long arcs, the hours continued forward, the axis of the earth pulling light toward decline. The beauty of the day lay precisely in its impermanence. Shadows lengthened not forever but toward dusk. Rivers glowed not eternally but for a passing age of brightness. Even the long light was measured not in infinity but in cycles. Entropy was present even here, hidden in fading beams, in the slow cooling that always follows warmth. Still, the long light left questions in its wake. Did the creatures beneath it perceive its weight? Could they sense that their days were part of greater rhythms? Cycles of climate, cycles of oxygen, cycles that would one day collapse entire forests into stone? Or did they perceive only surface? Food, danger, rest, shade? Perhaps both. Perhaps the light, in burning across their scales or illuminating their wings, left something within them we can no longer read. A sensation of time stretched thin, of worlds wider than their own motion. In the end, the day's advance was slow but inevitable. Night approached, though patient and almost reluctant, and as sunlight ebbed away, the land prepared for what was older still. Erosion's hand, pressing itself over everything. For long after light has gone and shadows folded into dark, it is the slow crumble of stone, the endless patience of weather, that reclaims all that brightness has revealed. As the long daylight of the Jurassic stretched and softened into evening, the land itself endured its own slow transformations, more patient than creatures, more inexorable than forests. Above rivers, beyond plains, mountains rose with the permanence of gods. Yet even they, vast and immovable as they seemed, were already dissolving. Not with thunder, not with collapse, but with the quietest gesture of time. Erosion, nature's gentlest hand, and yet the one that reclaims all. Mountains crumbled, unseen by those who roamed their slopes. Dinosaurs climbed valleys unaware that the trails beneath them were temporary, destined to wash away. Forests rooted deeply in soil that itself was only borrowed stone, softened by wind and rain. Even cliffs standing proud at the sea's edge leaned, inconsequentially yet inevitably, toward surrender. And all of it happened too slowly for eyes to notice. Only in retrospect, stitched through millions of years, can we perceive what was occurring always in silence. Every speck of stone, carried toward the waiting oceans. Erosion is often mistaken for destruction, yet it is not destruction at all but continuation. Rain falls across stone, wind lifts dust into air, rivers grind pebbles smoother with each turn. None of this is violent. It is steady, cyclical reshaping. Every cliff eventually softens into slope. Every peak eventually lowers into valley. Every fragment returns to sea, to be pressed into sediment, to rise later as mountain again. The landscape is memory rewritten, erased and redrafted endlessly, not because permanence fails, but because impermanence ensures renewal. Science captures this patient process in layers. We read its work in sediments arranged on ocean beds, each one carrying minerals eroded from stone continents away. We see it in the chemistry of sand grains, their hardness and lineage betraying origins in mountains lifted by tectonic fire long before. Glacial striations, river deltas, coastal cliffs, all are the brushstrokes of erosion's hand. Together they sketch a portrait of time, wide and continuous, entirely invisible within the span of a day. To imagine watching this with Jurassic eyes is to imagine perceiving nothing at all. A dinosaur crossing open plain would not have seen the mountain shrinking behind it. A fern rooting into soil could not have sensed the stone beneath softening into sand. But time saw it. Time felt every raindrop as a tool. Time listened to dust riding on wind, depositing thousands of miles away. Erosion, after all, is not haste. It is patience personified. It is the artistry of billions of years at work, reminding us that endurance takes shape not in standing tall, but in acceptance of being reshaped. And yet, erosion holds memory within its quietness. Each grain of sand is lineage compressed into silence. Once stone, once mountain, once upheaval. The fragments we step upon on beaches today may have been pieces of Jurassic cliffs, ground small by storms and carried into oceans where they layered as sediment. To hold such sand in your hand is to cradle in your palm not just dust, but deep time condensed. That is erosion's paradox. By undoing, it preserves. By scattering, it stores. By erasing, it writes anew. Imagine the feel of a Jurassic wind, dry and faintly warm, as it lifts particles from the surfaces of cliffs, dispersing them invisibly into the horizon. No creature notices. No eyes trace this migration. Yet across millions of years, those particles accumulate in deltas vast enough to reshape coastlines, thick enough to bury forests, patient enough to capture fossils in perfect detail. Mountains may aspire to permanence, but erosion ensures memory belongs instead to motion. Perhaps this is why erosion unsettles us. It reveals that permanence is illusion. Civilization builds in stone, yet even stone folds down with patience. Temples collapse, monuments weather, names inscribed on rock soften until unreadable. If mountains themselves cannot endure, what claim do we have to timelessness? Yet the humbling becomes also a comfort. For though erosion undoes form, it does not undo meaning. What is carried away becomes part of something larger, something awaiting its next cycle of transformation. Every cliff lent itself to silence. Every slope bent toward smoothing. Every canyon, sharp-edged and formidable, was quietly softened second by second, carried away into rivers that whispered of distance and return. To walk in the Jurassic was to tread on landscapes already in the act of surrender. What seemed eternal was already impermanent. What felt immovable was already on its long path back to sea. In this, erosion becomes not an ending but a teacher. It reminds us to see permanence and absence as threads of the same weave. That nothing, no matter how vast, stands outside the reach of impermanence. And as the plumes of dust stretched again across the dimming sky, falling into rivers that ran always toward oceans, the faint truth emerged. All endings carried within them the beginnings of what follows. Even the most solid mountain would one day become silence, and silence, inevitably, would one day turn into fossil, ash, or dust renewed. And so the Jurassic day continued, softened by erosion's touch. And yet, in every softened line, another truth approached. Endings were not far. Cycles playing endlessly were not confined to forests and cliffs but extended into extinction itself. For if single stones can vanish, then so too can entire worlds. Erosion softened mountains grain by grain, crafting endings so gentle they were almost unnoticeable. But the earth does not always choose patience. Some endings arrive not as slow dispersals, but as ruptures in time, eras collapsing into silence within days or even mere hours. Extinction is not a single event but a thread woven into every dawn, hidden within the brightness of day as surely as shadow is hidden within light. Even in the Jurassic, a world so abundant, so thrumming with forests and seas, the possibility of loss was already waiting. Each sunrise carried within it the seed of eventual silence. It is difficult for us to imagine such contradictions. To look upon landscapes thick with conifers, rivers filled with fish, oceans uneasily balanced between predator and prey, and to understand that all of it existed under the shadow of impermanence. Yet geology insists upon this truth. Layers of stone mark turning points where life shifted dramatically. Fossils vanish in sudden boundaries. Species drop away with little warning. Chemical signatures in rock reveal abrupt changes in atmosphere and ocean. These were not myths born long after. They are written into the stone itself, a memory so quiet and patient we can only barely perceive its scale. Science names many causes. Asteroids striking, releasing fire and ash to darken skies. Volcanism flooding the air with gases poisonous in their abundance. Oceans shifting in warmth and acidity, overturning ecosystems that had stood for millions of years. Climates tilting suddenly, drying forests, drowning plains. Each mechanism different, but their result shared. Endings woven so deeply into the weave of time that no age escapes entirely. And yet, extinction is never only about loss. It is transformation. Each disappearance opens paths for something new, even when that newness asks for unbearable prices. The great reptiles of one age are replaced by new dominions. The fallen forests of one epoch fertilize another's beginnings. Extinction is the Earth's reminder that permanence has no place in its design. The dawn is not arrival alone. It is also the reminder of possibility, both for life and for absence. But pause here and imagine, if you can, a single Jurassic morning. The light stretching long, the forests dense in their green dominion, dinosaurs moving slow with the weight of their size, insects shimmering like fragments of glass, ammonites drifting in the tides offshore. To witness this would be to witness abundance. Nothing in that moment would hint at collapse. Yet collapse is always invisible within the scale of a single day. Only the long eye of time reveals how every dawn carries its own shadow. Perhaps the Earth remembers extinction differently than we do. For us, it is tragedy, silence, erasure. For the planet, it may be little more than transition, the folding of one layer into another, the chemical resetting of air and water, the rebalancing of cycles that had tilted too far. Carbon surges, oxygen wanes, isotopes shift. On we read these patterns like journals, but to Earth itself, they may simply be breath, an exhale before new lungs inhale again. And here we return to entropy. Nothing resists decay forever. Not mountains, not forests, not species. Entropy waits even in abundance, quiet, for the chance to restructure. Extinction is entropy on the scale of life itself, vast reorderings, entire lineages undone. And yet even entropy, in its patient inevitability, does not end memory. Fossils remain. Isotopes whisper. Dust drifts into layers that preserve the moment in absence. Out of loss, a strange kind of presence unfolds. There is a question lingering here, one none of us can escape. Is extinction failure? Or is it merely the continuation of time's larger design? We see the vanished ammonite, the lost conifer, the vanished creature fossilized mid-flight, and our instinct whispers grief. But perhaps grief itself is our form of memory, a way of participating in cycles that were never designed to carry permanence. Maybe the very fragility of life is what makes its brief presence so luminous. The Jurassic day may have felt eternal in its abundance, but each sunrise hinted at its transience. Not by foretelling the exact catastrophes still waiting millions of years ahead, not by showing the asteroid yet unloosed, nor the volcanism swelling in hidden chambers, but by embodying the truth that every system carries its own undoing within it. Life thrives, and in thriving, it sows the seeds of imbalance, of collapse, of rebirth. Every dawn, then, is a threshold, not only of light, but of endings already folded within beginnings. Perhaps this is why extinction, though vast, does not erase everything. Always something persists, however small. The fern returning after fire, the mollusk surviving a warming sea, the bird that outlives its ancient ancestry. The thread of life bends, frays, but does not wholly snap. In the aftermath of every dawn of extinction, another dawn has always eventually followed. And so, as we stand at the horizon of the Jurassic morning, seeing light stretch across landscapes not yet marked by the silence of great endings, we must recognize the paradox. That loss and presence are inseparable. That life and absence weave their cloth together. That every dawn, however abundant, is stitched with extinction waiting quietly in its folds. And from that thought we move forward, gently into a reflection of ourselves, not of what was erased, but of what we too one day might leave behind. For if all life passes, then surely our traces, too, will sink one day into silence, pressed into strange new fossils for futures we will not see. Extinctions remind us that nothing lasts, not forests, not creatures, not entire ages. And yet, within each loss, the Earth carries forward fragments, pressing them into its memory through stone, isotope, and sediment. Shells become fossils, forests become coal, bones become archives preserved under layers of silt. Every age leaves its signature. And so, a question lingers quietly over us tonight. When our age has passed, what will remain? If ammonites and ferns left their echoes in stone, then what strange remnants will Earth keep from us? Scientists have already given them a name: technofossils. Plastics, alloys, glass, concrete, and silicon pressed into strata, folded into riverbeds, scattered across ocean floors. Unlike bone or shell, these are not shaped by natural cycles, but by us, by the brief dominion of human industry. And so the question rises, if our materials endure, which of them will Earth choose to preserve, and how long will that preservation last? Will fragments of steel towers one day sit beside ammonites in cliffs of the distant future? Will layers of plastic polymers mark our epoch as clearly as an ash line or a magnetic reversal? The irony is unsettling. Ammonite shells were fragile in life, yet stone remembers them across 150 million years. Our plastics boast imperishability, but in boasting, they sow another kind of fragility. Polymer chains break into microfragments, scattering not into permanence, but into dust so fine it remains everywhere, impossible to separate. These are the fossils of our age. Not singular monuments, but dispersed particles, fractures, endlessly abundant. Memory diluted across whole oceans, embedding itself in the very tissue of living things. Unlike the ammonite, which left spirals of beauty, our trace may be one of fragmentation. And still, some things may endure in the permanence we once intended. Alloys fused in engines, glass resistant to decay, ceramics that withstand deep pressure. All may rest at the seafloor as long as tectonics allow. Perhaps, millions of years from now, when continents have rearranged and climates reshaped, geologists not yet imagined will discover layers of concrete mixed with seashell, microchips preserved in mud, steel fossilized into ferrous veins. To them, these may seem as strange and natural as coral skeletons appear to us today. Evidence of life building cities beneath oceans, structures born of chemistry, not bone. If so, what will they conclude of us? That we were as fleeting as ammonites, but louder? That our dominion was not written in canopy or scale, but in byproducts, waste laid down as geological testimony. The Earth remembers differently than we do. It does not care for names or hierarchies, but for chemistry, keeps no preference for beauty or harm. It archives what it receives, stone or silicon, shell or polymer, all pressed equally into strata as strange signatures of entropy. In that way, our memory may endure not through language or culture, but through the placement of materials no other species could have imagined. And yet, memory is never perfect. Many of our technofossils will vanish as surely as ferns and forests did. Subduction zones will gather them, recycle them into magma, erase them completely. Oceans will hold them only as long as currents allow. Even steel will rust, even polymers will break down, even glass will fracture. Perhaps our ultimate legacy is not permanence at all, but dispersal. Our memory scattered so finely that it becomes indistinguishable from the chemistry of future worlds. The thought is humbling. A civilization devoted to permanence, monuments built of stone, archives of knowledge stored in digital form, will be remembered far less perfectly than a simple ammonite shell. Our fossils may not be graceful spirals but fractured signals, incomplete, asking more questions than they answer. The future may not see our glory, only our residue. Yet even residue, once recognized, becomes memory. In some distant tomorrow, the faint line of plastic embedded in rock might tell as much about us as trilobite beds tell us about oceans long gone. And perhaps this is enough. It reminds us that memory is not about control. It is about participation in cycles larger than ourselves. Ammonites did not design their shells for us to find. Yet we found them, and through them we imagine a vanished sea. Plastic does not intend to endure, but it will. And through it, something of us will remain, no matter how fragmented, no matter how estranged from its original purpose. Extinction, renewal, residue, all are fabrics of the same design. Ours is a strange thread, colored by technology, woven briefly in time, destined to unravel into memory Earth translates into stone. And when future minds, whoever they are, stumble upon what remains of us, perhaps they will wonder, what were we, what did we value, what did we forget? And as we linger on those questions, it leads us deeper into shadow. For if our trace can seem alien even to ourselves, What of civilizations that may have walked this planet long before, erased too thoroughly for even technofossils to reveal them? What shadows lie buried beyond the reach of science, waiting only in speculation? The thought that our plastics and alloys might one day mark our species in stone naturally gives rise to another question, one both haunting and irresistible. What if it has happened before? What if, long before us, minds walked this planet, minds as curious, as restless as ours, now erased so thoroughly that their memory is no longer distinguishable from the geology around us? The notion sounds at first like myth, like legend whispered around fires, but the Earth's silence is full of gaps, and in those gaps, speculation blooms. If earlier civilizations existed, their traces would not be found easily. We expect ruins, columns, tools, writings, but stone is patient and erases such things with unsettling completeness. Mountains crumble. Oceans subduct entire coastlines into fire below. Glaciers grind surface into dust. In less than 1,000,000 years, human cities themselves would vanish almost without a trace. So what of a civilization that might have lived tens of millions of years ago, before the last age of dinosaurs or even earlier still? Perhaps all that is left are shadows we no longer recognize as shadows. Some scientists have playfully considered this idea, sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis. The speculation that if an industrial age had occurred in deep time, its only evidence might survive as subtle chemical anomalies. Layers of carbon shifted unnaturally, sudden deposits of synthetic-like compounds, or isotope ratios skewed beyond natural expectation. Stones we assume to be purely geological may, in truth, be the last unread messages of eras too far gone to imagine. Their traces might be mistaken for natural forms, odd mineral veins that were once alloys refined, angular formations that were once deliberate structures. Memory disguised as geology. And what of signals? Our own world hums invisibly with transmissions, from radio waves to satellites. Yet even these fade, dissolving into background noise the further they drift into time and space. If earlier civilizations broadcast, their voices may still cross the universe in echoes too weak to detect, or they may already be lost, drowned in entropy before they could reach another ear. Even within Earth itself, any deltas of information, carvings, writings, languages, would either erode or be folded into subduction zones, written out of the record entirely. But consider fossils again. We read ammonites and trilobites as life, not as culture, because we find only shells, not intentions. If an earlier intelligence shaped its world through biology rather than through structures, how would we know? Could a fossil we revere as mere creature have been, in fact, part of something designed? The thought unsettles gently, not because we expect answers, but because it reveals how much of Earth's history is unreadable, how much lives only in speculation. Extinction ensures forgetting. Civilizations rise and fall, but geology does not promise remembrance. It archives accident and accident alone. What is buried quickly, what is preserved by chance, what chemistry locks into permanence. If earlier minds walked here, their memories may not differ from ours. They may be forgotten except as faint shifts in isotope ratios, as dust now inseparable from stone. And yet, here lies the paradox. Absence, too, is a kind of memory. The gaps in the fossil record remind us just as much as the fossils themselves. They remind us that forgetting is the rule, remembrance the exception. If we listen closely, perhaps absence itself becomes whisper. Whispers telling us we are not the first, or that if we are, we too shall one day be as untraceable as the ones we wonder about now. Speculation is not proof, but it opens a window into existential humility. We stand momentarily aware that the Earth is not ours alone, nor solely defined by what we see before us. Its past is longer, its silence deeper, than even our imagination can reach. If civilizations rose and fell here already, they do not contradict the story of Earth. They join it, becoming part of the same cycles of impermanence that sweep forests, reefs, and mountains alike. And so, as the Jurassic Day moves ever further, we are reminded that the planet itself is the only true archive, one which records unevenly, incompletely, in fragments that behave as riddles. We see shadows, we sense possibilities, and then we lose them in the distance of geologic silence. Perhaps the Earth has kept such secrets many times. Perhaps we, too, will be reduced not to monuments, but to whispers under layers of stone. And if memory itself is this fragile, flowing through silence and erasure, then perhaps we should turn our attention next to where Earth holds its recollections most clearly. Not in ruins and not in fossils, but in the planet's own body, in its rocks and strata, in its vast planetary memory written page by page across eons. The Earth does not keep its memories in journals, in letters, or in songs. Preserves them in stone. Every cliff, every strata, every folded layer of sediment is a page written not by hand, but by pressure, chemistry, and time. Each page is pressed into silence, thin yet immense in what it contains. And though the writing lacks words, it remains readable to those who approach with patience, with questions, with humility. Geology is this reading, the act of listening to a library where every volume is bound in silence. Each stratum is time flattened into permanence. A bed of shale may hold spores that once floated from forests long eroded away. A line of limestone may carry the patient work of coral reefs that bloomed, collapsed, and rose again beneath ancient seas. A seam of coal remembers vast swamps where cycads and ferns exhaled their oxygen, their bodies pressed into blackened memory that would hide under continents for millions of years. Even ash, erupted in violence, settles as a thin page of suddenness, a marker of when fire briefly ruled. The Earth writes endlessly, in a script eroded but not erased. Science has learned to translate small portions of this planetary text. Radiometric dating uses the steady decay of isotopes, clocks hidden in minerals, to measure when a stone began. Oxygen isotopes reveal warmth or cold, hinting at glacial ages or humid greenhouse climates. Carbon ratios preserve hints of mass extinctions, entire forests burning, life surrendering to alteration. In this way, the Earth keeps track of what once was, not in deliberate record, but in inevitability. Atoms shift whether anyone asks them to or not. Memory happens in silence. Imagine peeling back those layers as if they were pages beneath your hands. A Jurassic seafloor pressed into limestone, revealing ammonite spirals and fish with scales perfectly etched. Beneath it, Triassic layers thick with reptilian footprints, pressed when mud was soft, preserved when sediment hardened over them. Beneath that, Permian layers bearing ash and absence, the record of the great dying that silenced nearly everything. Each page tells not only what lived, but also what was lost. Each page preserves both presence and absence together, bound so tightly you cannot separate them. Yet geology also hides memory. Layers fold, crack, and vanish. Entire libraries of stone are subducted into the mantle, melted into oblivion. The Earth rewrites itself, carrying some lessons forward while obliterating others without trace. This incompleteness is not failure. It is part of the design. Memory is not meant to be whole. The gaps and strata remind us that forgetting is as deep a process as remembering, that there are voices of the planet we will never hear, entire ages folded back into fire before we could ever glimpse them. Perhaps this is why the metaphor of planetary memory humbles us, because it reminds us that the Earth does not prioritize clarity for us, keeps no record for our understanding. It simply is. Yet when we approach with patience, with drills into ancient ice, with careful hands brushing stone in desert cliffs, we glimpse its recollections. We find the trace of air locked in bubbles 2 million years old, the shadow of a fern pressed flat into shale, the isotopic fingerprint of seas warmed and cooled across cycles too vast to grasp. Each fragment is part of the memory. Collectively, they allow us to imagine the story, even with missing chapters. And in imagining, we realize the planet remembers differently than we do. Where our human memory is bound by emotion, sensation, and continuity, the Earth remembers in fragments, in pressures, in chance. But both kinds of memory share impermanence. Just as our own lives forget far more than they keep, so too does the planet. Perhaps memory is never meant to be total, but only partial glimmers, reminders of continuity without illusion of completeness. There is also poetry here, that the planet itself is the witness, that we walk upon a remembering body. Every step presses onto layers that already carry epochs. Every mountain we look upon is a folded archive of chapters we cannot read fully. Even silence is memory here, gaps between strata, blanks that ask us to imagine what belonged between them. The earth does not forget us. It does not remember us deliberately either. Instead, it keeps going, leaving traces where it will. We join its library only by chance, the chance of fossilization, the chance of burial, the chance of stones' long patience. And so planetary memory is not just what we uncover. It is the humility of realizing how incomplete we are as readers. We catch fragments, enough to weave stories like this one, enough to sense continuity, enough to be awed. But we never hold the whole book. Perhaps no one ever can. Memory on this scale will always outpace the beings who try to piece it together. Yet, in those fragments lies wonder. To press one's hands to warm sandstone and recognize shells embedded in it. To stand at the foot of cliffs and notice layers in colors shifting like stacked horizons. To hold a fossil ammonite and, in tracing its spiral, understand that this was once a body, a living form, a participant in cycles of sea and sun. Through such fragments, planetary memory speaks, not in words but in wonder. And while we listen, the earth continues writing. With every storm, every eruption, every drift of wind-borne dust, the library adds new pages. Someday we too, like ammonites and forests, will be pressed into its archive in ways we cannot foresee. What will remain, if anything, will join that uneven story, catalogued not by intention but by chance, by entropy, by the slow hand of geology. And from this recognition, another thought arises, one carried forward by every tide. If the planet's very memory is bound not in permanence but in cycles, then nowhere holds this truth so clearly as the oceans, where entropy is ceaseless, yet always balanced in deep rhythms. Water erodes, dissolves, and carries fragments endlessly onward. Oceans of entropy, where memory is both dissolved and renewed without end. In the layered rocks of the continents, the planet's archive is written flat, page upon page. But in the oceans, the script is restless, always rewriting itself. Water, more than stone, reminds us of entropy, its patience, its inevitability. For life in every form resists decay, building shells, weaving structures, shaping bodies against time. Yet the oceans erode all of it. They dissolve mountains grain by grain, grind coral into fragments, sift fossils into sand. Nothing resists forever, and in this endless movement, the seas remind us of truth. Entropy is patient. Currents are the hands of this patience, sculpting invisibly, carrying what was solid into suspension, carrying fragments further than a creature might travel in its entire existence. Dust lifted from cliffs becomes sediment thousands of miles away. Coral empires, vibrant with life, are dismantled wave by wave into reefs of rubble, then sand, then chemical trace. Even shells, meant as protection against the world, dissolve slowly into minerals, released again into water, forgotten by form but carried onward as chemistry. To walk along a Jurassic shore was to see only a fraction of this work. Waves broke upon beaches, tides swept steadily, and from the surface it seemed rhythmic, almost peaceful. Yet beneath, the real work never ceased. Rocks were ground smooth in unseen collisions. Skeletons of once living things rolled and thinned until indistinguishable from the sand beneath them. The sea floor gathered these fragments in layers, pressing them further with weight, collapsing them into stone that would later rise as cliffs. Even the silence of the seabed was full of entropy at work. Pressure, compaction, shifting. Science gives us metaphors to measure this. We speak of the carbon cycle, of isotopes moving from atmosphere to water, from shell to sediment. We speak of dissolved calcium from worn reefs feeding the next colony's growth. Nothing vanishes, nothing departs from the cycle, yet nothing endures in the form we think of as permanent. The molecules persist. The form does not. Oceans are the patient reminder that matter is eternal, and memory is not. And yet, in this dissolution, a strange kind of preservation exists. Whole reefs are lost, but their remains become the limestone cliffs we walk on millions of years later. Skeletons shatter, but their fragments reveal to us the chemistry of ancient seas. The grinding force of the ocean undoes life, But in undoing, it also writes life into stone. Entropy here is not erasure but translation. A translation that takes millions of years to complete, too long for any eye to witness, but legible nonetheless if we learn to read. Perhaps that is the paradox of oceans. They erase and preserve at once. They tell us that memory cannot remain unaltered, but transformed, scattered, pressed into silence until someone, or something, eventually uncovers it. Even now, ocean currents continue this quiet work, dragging plastic as readily as they once dragged shell, embedding our own story into entropy's ongoing archive. The message of oceans is consistent. Nothing withstands patience. Even mountains bow to salt and tide. Standing on a Jurassic coastline, you would not have felt this dissolution. You would have only seen the shining surface, the endless glitter of waves beneath the sun. Yet beneath, salt and pressure were dismantling entire worlds, carrying fragments into quiet burial. The ocean smiled at its surface while entropy labored in depth. Every wave was a reminder disguised as beauty. Stillness is never still. Silence is never absence. And so the record of oceans continues, restless and incomplete. Every cycle pristine yet unfinished. Life resists, entropy waits, form dissolves. It is a rhythm that does not stop, and within it lies both humility and comfort. For entropy is not cruelty. It is the rhythm by which stories are carried on, rewritten into another form, another silence. Oceans do not destroy memory. They dilute it, until all things become one with the endless, patient sea. And as light dimmed toward evening, shadows lengthening across Jurassic coasts, stone and wave carried their endless dialogue in silence. And it was within stone, within the erosion and deposition of rock, that the echoes of this dialogue would linger, whispers etched into strata for futures to come. If oceans remind us that entropy is patient, then stone reminds us that nothing is ever erased completely. Rocks listen. They do not listen as we do, straining for sound in the air. Their memory is kept in other forms, in texture and fracture, in layered weight, in isotopes and chemistry. These are echoes not of voices, but of vanished forests, dissolved rains, climates breathed out millions of years before. To press your hand against stone is to touch an archive, though the language it speaks is not ours. Every rock carries within it a ghost of its origin. Volcanic basalt whispers of molten chambers once alive beneath the crust. Shale remembers rivers, fine sediments pressed into sheets by the quiet persistence of gravity. Sandstone recalls beaches and dunes, ancient winds that once moved ceaseless storms of dust across plains. Limestone keeps the patient labor of corals and shells, calcium secretions that built empires only to crumble and reform deeper below. Each type of stone is a voice, and together they form a chorus, the planetary memory echoing softly beneath our feet. Science gives us ways of hearing these echoes. Isotope ratios within ancient minerals carry the imprint of climate shifts. Oxygen isotopes revealing winters of ice or ages of humid warmth. Strontium in rock captures the drift of continents, marking where seas rose and fell. Even microlayers within crystals record pressures and temperatures like tree rings, etching into mineral form the slow heartbeat of the earth. Listening to rocks is to listen to time slowed into silence, patient and impartial in what it shows. To stand among cliffs, their faces streaked with bands of color, is to look upon time's strata directly. Each line is a horizon, each shift in tone a subtle memory of a different world. One layer thick with fossils, another barren and dark with volcanic ash, another pale, carrying only the faint trace of dust from forgotten deserts. These cliffs do not rise suddenly but are built grain by grain, press by press, until thousands of years become single inches of stone. When the surface crumbles away, when a valley reveals its hidden walls, it is as though the rock has spoken aloud at last, lifting its silence just long enough for us to witness. Imagine the rain falling in a Jurassic forest, each drop cooling the air, feeding the ferns, nourishing the deep soil. The rain itself would vanish within minutes, absorbed or evaporated. Yet in stone its chemistry lingered. Hydrogen and oxygen, shifting subtly as isotopes, carried its signature forward into minerals. Millions of years later, long after the forest was gone, scientists can still trace those echoes, still hear the faint whisper of vanished storms in the rock's enduring memory. These are conversations no creature of that time could have preserved, yet the earth carried them anyway. But echoes in stone are never perfect. They are partial, broken, rearranged. Some memories are folded by tectonic forces, crumpled until lines tilt and vanish. Others are erased by subduction, carried downward into mantle, rewritten in molten silence. Still others are polished away by weathering, lost before anyone could read them. Memory on this scale is always incomplete, always fractured. And yet, even fragments reveal enough to remind us the earth does listen, even if its listening is indifferent, even if its retelling is scattered. Perhaps the most haunting thought is this: rocks hold not only the presence of what was, but also the absences. Gaps in strata where nothing was preserved speak as loudly as fossil beds teeming with shells. We read mass extinctions in stone not by abundance but by sudden silence, by the absence of layers where life should have continued. Echoes in stone remind us not only of what endured, but of what slipped past the reach of memory, forgotten ages that leave us only with quiet questions. There is a comfort in this as well, because even with its incompleteness, rock carries a persistence more enduring than any human archive. Our books, our data, our monuments, all too fragile compared to stone. Yet one day, some distant future may walk across layers bearing the faint imprint of roads, or the pressed chemistry of our industries, and interpret them the way we now interpret ammonites or coral, as echoes of a vanished epoch. Rocks, impartial as always, will hold at least some fragment of us as patiently as they held the Jurassic seas. So the echoes continue, layers pressed, minerals aligned, isotopes shifted, fractures etched. Earth remembers without judgment, holding deep time as matter itself. And as the Jurassic day went on, one memory folded into another, one echo blending into silence, until even life itself became part of stone. Among the many voices written there, some of the most enduring were not of predators or forests, but of ammonites. Their spirals frozen mid-curve, their shapes carrying whispers of time curved endlessly back upon itself. Among the many echoes carried in stone, few are as mesmerizing as the ammonite. Their shells, drawn into perfect spirals, appear like the geometry of time itself, frozen mid-turn. To hold one in the hand is to hold more than a fossil. It is to cradle a fragment of clockwork that never stops turning, even in silence. An ammonite spiral does not end. It curls inward endlessly, a form that suggests time itself might also be imagined as a curl, an eternal loop with no exit. Past folding into present, present already leaning into future, all contained in one pattern too timeless to belong to a single life. Ammonites thrived in the Jurassic seas, spiraling outward in complexity as if testing every possible version of their design. They were cephalopods, cousins to the nautilus and squid, building their shells chamber by chamber, filling sections with gas to rise, with liquid to sink. Each chamber laid down was a moment remembered, a room sealed behind them and left as archive. They lived only in the last, outer chamber, carrying their past selves along with them like a series of locked doors. Their lives were both forward-moving and backward-carrying, a quiet balance between progress and memory. Science reads them as markers, guides to an ocean that no longer exists. Their remains littered seabeds, so abundant that they help geologists date layers of stone. Each species had its own span, and when it was gone, its presence in rock ceased. A boundary line, a measure of time itself. Ammonites are clocks for us not only in form, but also in function. They track the flow of epochs the way their shells once tracked buoyancy. They are more than fossils. They are instruments of time. But there is also a dreamlike quality to them, a poetry that stone cannot erase. For their spirals speak beyond chronology. They suggest ideas that reach into philosophy, into imagination. What if time itself is less a line than a spiral? Always moving forward, yet always circling back, repeating rhythms, growing larger with each cycle. Seasons return, climates swing, species rise and vanish, but the cycle expands, carrying the echo of what has been into what is yet to come. This spiral is not a perfect arc. Never ends. Curls endlessly into infinity. Perhaps this is why their forms feel strangely human to us, why we hold ammonite fossils in museums and call them beautiful even though they are only stone remnants of a vanished sea creature. They show us more than life. They show us structure, pattern, reflection. Their shape seems to whisper that nothing is truly linear, that memory curls back into itself, that history repeats, that deep time has a rhythm we cannot ignore. There is no exit, no conclusion, only further spiraling. Imagine an ammonite drifting in a Jurassic current, its spiral shell glistening as light cut through the water. Around it, predators watched in silence. Shoals of fish broke and reformed like liquid architecture. And there it floated, chambered, ancient design perfected by eons, unaware that its shape was writing an idea of time we would only discover long after its extinction. In its simple presence was mathematics, aesthetics, philosophy. Each chamber a verse no human ear would ever hear, and yet we intuit it now as though the shell knew it was meant to be read. And what of the dream in its spiral? Could it be that these shells embody something universal, something not only about oceans but about all cycles? Galaxies spiral, storms spiral. Our very DNA coils into helices, holding memory like chambers sealed and carried forward. The ammonite, in its patient curl, reflected the wider architecture of being, reminding us that life, death, weather, and memory are all part of returning rhythm, pressed inside loops without end. And yet they all vanished. 99% of ammonite lineages disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous, swept away with the dinosaurs when an asteroid closed their long dominion. Entire seas emptied of their spirals, leaving only their stone shells for us to find. Their dreamlike spirals did not protect them. Time curled forward without them. And still, in fossils, their spirals turn on. In stone, the dream continues. If their shells are clocks, then perhaps they are also mirrors. We look at them and wonder about our own place in time's spiral. Will we too leave only fragments, traces preserved by accident rather than intent? Will our memory curl back upon itself until our presence is indistinguishable from absence? Perhaps ammonites remind us that permanence is not the point. The spiral continues whether it holds us or not. Continuity is not dependent on survival, only on rhythm. And so, as the Jurassic day drifted into its long arc, ammonite shells gathered on sea floors, building thick beds of spirals that would one day calcify into cliffs. Time carried them downward, compacting their spiral dreams into strata, where they would sleep for millions of years. When we awaken them now, when we hold them to our eyes under modern skies, we see not only a fossil but a vision of time as an endless curl, a dream without exit. And from those spirals our thought drifts outward again, to cycles larger still, to the rhythms upon which even worlds depend. For every Jurassic creature lived and breathed within balance, cycles of ocean, atmosphere, and climate. And those cycles themselves became empires, silent yet absolute, the frameworks upon which all else depended. Every age of Earth has lived within cycles. The Jurassic was no different. Every sunrise that spilled across fern canopies, every tide that carried ammonites, every breath exhaled by forest or creature, each was part of a rhythm repeating endlessly, binding life together in patterns too vast for individuals to see. Volcano and rain, oxygen and breath, decay and renewal, predator and prey. These cycles were not optional. They were the framework itself, and every being survived only so long as the rhythm continued unbroken. The world's balance was not delicate, as we sometimes imagine, but dynamic, constantly tipping, constantly restoring, imperfect yet persistent. Volcanoes painted the skies with ash, their eruptions blanketing forests into sudden silence. Yet in that silence, soil was enriched, minerals spread wide, and life began again, stronger with what was left behind. Rivers flooded and rewrote valleys, drowning some creatures while spreading nutrients across new plains on which forests rooted. Even death itself was not an end, but a continuation, each fallen body becoming fuel for soil, each decay feeding breath into the next generation. The world held its balance not in stillness, but in continual motion. Science sees this clearly. Carbon cycles through soil, water, and atmosphere, bound tightly to oxygen in the long dialogue of respiration. Volcanoes inject carbon dioxide into the sky. Plants draw it back down through photosynthesis. Rain sculpts landforms while replenishing rivers. Ocean currents redistribute heat, regulating climates that otherwise would swing too wildly for life to persist. Each system is not a singular path but a loop, one that constantly folds back upon itself. To live in the Jurassic was to live inside this vast circuitry, whether as creature, forest, or reef. Even extinction, frightening though it seems, was part of this rhythm. The fall of one lineage fed the rise of another. The collapse of forests fertilized soil for their successors. The thinning of ecosystems did not always mark an end, but often a rewriting. What truly threatened life was not death, it was the breaking of cycles. When carbon or oxygen tilted beyond repair, when climates shifted faster than adaptation could follow, continuity faltered. It was not single deaths that erased lineages, but interruptions in the cycles on which all depended. Breaking the cycle, in the end, was the only true extinction. Imagine this balance on a smaller scale. A Jurassic herbivore feeds on ferns, its digestion slowly releasing energy. Predators pursue it, not out of malice but necessity, their hunger another gear in the machine of life. When both predator and prey die, their bodies decompose into soil, minerals returning to the roots of plants. The plants restore the air with oxygen, which the next generation inhales again. Each role is temporary, yet the loop is endless. That is the meaning of cycles. Permanence not in the individual but in the system. It is humbling to realize this includes us too. Our lungs still breathe in oxygen made by plants today, oxygen shaped by countless earlier forests stretching back to the Jurassic. Our bones carry calcium that once dissolved in ancient seas, calcium released by reefs that grew and died millions of years ago. Each breath and each heartbeat participates in the same loops ammonites and dinosaurs once shared, the same exchanges that forests and volcanoes negotiated through deep time. Individually fleeting, we are sustained only because cycles continue. But cycles are never guaranteed. They wobble and shift like the delicate chambers of an ammonite shell. Even in the Jurassic, there were disruptions. Volcanic seasons that pushed climates into imbalance, ocean anoxic events where seas suffocated for centuries, species swept away when cycles failed to restore their rhythm. The planet endured, but never unchanged. The memory of these disruptions is still present in chemistry, in isotope ratios, in dark sedimentary bands showing oxygen stripped away. These records remind us that balance is fragile not because of weakness, but because it relies on constant renewal. If renewal pauses, collapse follows. The cycles are storytellers of entropy as well. For even as they preserve continuity, entropy quietly threads through. Decay is necessary for soil, dissolution necessary for oceans, storms necessary for renewal. Life resists entropy, but never fully. In truth, it participates, weaving entropy into patterns that sustain. Perhaps this is the most mysterious quality of all. That balance itself requires forgetting, requires dissolving, requires disappearance as much as continuity. And this offers us a profound reflection. We may imagine cycles as protective nets, but they are not protection. They are simply the way the world moves forward. They do not prevent extinction. They return extinction into something new. They do not prevent forgetting. They fold forgetting into memory's fabric. What is fragile, then, is not balance itself, it is our expectation of permanence. To live within cycles is to surrender to impermanence as the only guarantee. The Jurassic day, in its slow unfolding, was carried by these cycles. Its sunlit hours were not singular, but connections in long chains. Volcanoes breathing carbon, ferns reclaiming it into leaf, cliffs crumbling into sand, oceans pressing sand back into stone. Each moment was both an ending and a continuation. Each breath drawn by a creature was a repetition of 1 billion earlier inhalations, soon to feed 1 billion more. And as the long light dimmed, casting forests and plains into extended shade, the balance quietly persisted. Cycles whisper their patience. They outlast moments, outlast species, outlast even ages. And yet, within their patient loops, every day ends. Darkness comes, and with it another form of endurance. The stillness of night, the long quiet of midnight seas where predators vanish into shadow and currents flow unseen. When the long light finally yielded, when shadows deepened until the last traces of day vanished from horizon and forest, the Jurassic world entered a slower rhythm. Night did not bring erasure, only a shift. In the seas, predators that had ruled the daylight withdrew into quiet, their silhouettes fading into darkness beyond vision. Currents moved softly now, less disturbed by frenzy. Their weight felt in the silence more than heard in sound. Life slowed, but slowness was not stillness. It was simply another measure of time, a patient continuation of movement unseen. Midnight in the Jurassic Ocean did not resemble absence. Instead, it was a kind of fullness, the quiet hum of processes unnoticed until day's noise receded. Microscopic plankton drifted upward toward unreachable stars, seeking light and food in layers close to the surface. Bioluminescence sparked faintly in deeper waters, igniting patches of greenish glow, each a pulse in darkness, as though the sea itself exhaled firefly breath. Small fish traced delicate arcs where moonlight touched waters, while below, shadows vast and slow passed without sound. Science reminds us that darkness is not an end to cycles but their extension. Photosynthesis rests, but respiration continues. Organisms feed, even if the feeding is quieter, more concealed. Currents persist, ferrying nutrients from surface to deep, deep to surface, recycling silences into new beginnings. Even mountains on the seafloor shift in imperceptible increments, basalt swelling with heat, rocks cracking and cooling, all beneath a cover of absolute quiet. The stillness is only our illusion. Entropy never sleeps, chemistry never pauses. To imagine this ocean night is to imagine time folding inward, a suspension of urgency. Predators that filled hours with speed now wait in shadow, conserving energy until dawn. Ammonites drift with slow deliberation, shells glinting faintly under scattered, borrowed light. Reefs so animated in day sink into quiet colonies, polyps withdrawn, their structures holding steady. And in that pause, a sense of endurance grows, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening too steadily to break the silence. Stillness at sea is never absolute. Molecules shift, waves rise and settle. Unseen tectonic energy rumbles far below. Even the most silent night contains deep certainties of motion. But stillness is also perception, a rhythm too subtle for immediate senses. For the creatures that swam then, perhaps the pause of darkness carried a sense of safety, or of waiting, or of timelessness. For us, imagining from distance, it unfolds as a lesson. Stillness is not absence, it is continuity. Not pause, but persistence. Standing on a Jurassic shore at midnight, you would hear the waves only faintly, their rhythms softened into something almost indistinguishable from breath. The forest behind would be heavy with shadows, only the occasional call breaking its hush. Before you, the ocean would reveal nothing. No form, no edge, just the surface reflecting thin streaks of moonlight, endless and absolute. Yet beneath, multitudes lived on unseen. To witness it was to face the paradox of night, that what feels like erasure is only life reshaping its rhythm. Perhaps this was the truest balance, the oscillation between day and night, motion and stillness, predator and retreat. Perhaps what we call darkness is itself a kind of archive, a space where time folds inward, where memory is written not in scale or fossils but in continuity of breath, unbroken even when invisible. And in this reminder, we glimpse again the deeper truth. Silence does not mean nothing endures. Silence means everything continues, in the language of patience. As the midnight hours turned over, as the unseen minutes passed like water through unseen currents, the oceans carried their continuity forward. Not loudly, not spectacularly, but unbroken. And from this stillness, as though drawn from below the surface, arose the larger voice of deep time itself. The slow mathematics of eons, invisible even to oceans, calculating in pressures and ages the shape of everything still to come. When the oceans settled into their midnight quiet, when predators folded into shadow and only unseen currents whispered through the dark, another rhythm continued, far deeper and vaster than any creature could comprehend. It was the rhythm of eons. The mathematics of time stretched far beyond a lifetime, beyond even the ages of forests or seas. For the Earth, patience is the only equation it keeps, and its arithmetic is written not in numbers but in pressure, heat, erosion, and decay. Eons calculate differently. Where we count hours on clocks, eons tally centuries in minerals compressed into sedimentary stone. Where we speak of decades, eons measure by mountains rising and falling, their peaks as temporary as waves' crests are to oceans. Pressure is one axis of this math, heat another. Every grain buried deeper, every atom shifting under weight, adds to the invisible equation by which landscapes are shaped. And within this slow computation, nothing is hurried, nothing is wasted. The mathematics is patient because it does not need to be fast. To Earth, the difference between 1,000 years and 1,000,000 is no more significant than the pause between breaths. Rocks fold quietly, continents drift measured only in inches per lifetime. And yet, across millions of years, these inches span oceans, redraw maps, and open highways of migration for life newly born. The slow movement of plates becomes Earth's long division, cutting continents apart and multiplying coasts, raising mountains and then subtracting them into valleys with perfect inevitability. Radiometric clocks are the instruments that let us glimpse this equation. The decay of isotopes within zircon crystals or volcanic ash layers counts backwards into the unthinkable, showing us when oceans formed, when climates shifted, when extinctions cut across life's pattern. Decay is not random. It is exact. Uranium becomes lead with consistent regularity, one half-life after another, as if reminding us that the slowest hands are the steadiest. Within these crystals, calculations billions of years long are kept in silence until we learn to listen. Imagine, for a moment, how this arithmetic would appear if it could be witnessed directly. A valley thick with ferns, slowly filling with sediment until river deltas smother growth, pressing layer upon layer until forests themselves become coal. Heavy mountains erode under rain, carried grain by grain to beaches, only to be compacted into sandstone. All of it counted, every transfer a small addition, every loss a patient subtraction. Across eons, Earth rewrites its equations again and again, balancing them not for perfection, but for continuity. To stand in a Jurassic night and try to feel this calculation would be to encounter humility in its purest form. No creature could sense tectonic drift beneath their feet. No dinosaur could witness mountains rising beyond the arc of its short life. And yet these transformations were underway all the same. Creatures participated without knowing. Everything alive was a variable in the problem. Each meteorological season, each volcanic eruption, each slow cycle of rain feeding into rivers. The Earth did not count them separately. They were part of the balance, part of the math that never stopped adding itself forward. Perhaps this is why eons unsettle us. They refuse neat endings. They do not calculate toward a final answer but toward constant transformation. Erosions never pause. Volcanoes erupt again and again. Oceans shift their basins, their currents, their chemistry. Extinction arrives not as conclusion but as rearrangement of terms. Patience is the form of logic Earth prefers. And for us, impatient and fleeting, that patience feels almost cruel, an indifference disguised as inevitability. But there is comfort here too, because if time operates through eons, then it cannot be broken by singular moments of despair, nor annulled by the collapse of one lineage or the erosion of one mountain. Everything is gathered into scale, and the mathematics of scale ensures that even our smallest moments are part of a wider rhythm, even if incomprehensible. Just as a fossilized fern carries its memory forward, so too does our presence find its niche, folded into the infinite patience of pressure and decay. We may ask, then, is there meaning in this equation? Or does the Earth keep its math without intent, without aim, without recognition of us at all? Perhaps meaning is our own invention, but perhaps the spiral of ammonites, the layering of reefs, the persistence of isotopes speak of a different kind of message, not one meant for us, but one we have the chance to overhear. Eons do not teach us permanence. They teach us continuity, continuity written in stones, carried in oceans, pressed across forests, folded again beneath mountains. And so, in the stillness of the Jurassic night, under skies thick with the breaths of forests and seas, the planet counted onward, unhurried, untiring. Not seconds, not hours, but epochs. The sums were invisible. Its ledger was stone. Its patience was absolute. And when we listen now, when we read rocks like journals and shells like spirals, we recognize at last what this mathematics has been whispering for eons. That time itself is not measured in what remains, but in how memory dissolves and reforms endlessly into new equations. And from this thought, from the continuity of eons balancing themselves in patience, arises another truth waiting quietly in shadows, that memory, no matter how carefully preserved, must eventually erode, absorbed once again by entropy, by silence, by forgetting woven directly into Earth's design. Our memory of the Jurassic is incomplete. It always will be. What we carry forward are fragments. Bones weathered to half shapes, shells pressed shallow into stone, isotopic ratios so faint they must be teased from crystal lattices. The record is broken, eroded, written half in presence and half in silence. And still, even these fragments remind us that this incompleteness is not failure, but part of the nature of memory itself. For just as all things decay, so too does memory. Forgetting is not an accident. It is as natural as remembering. When we study fossils, we hold only moments captured by chance. A fallen leaf sealed by mud before rot took it. A skeleton drowned in a sudden flood. A ripple frozen after a storm. Infinite others, perhaps more beautiful, more complete, dissolved before they could ever be preserved. Our sense of the Jurassic is shaped not by what existed, but by what survived against improbable odds. In this sense, fossils are both memory and erasure. They offer glimpses while concealing more than they reveal. We reconstruct whole worlds from partial whispers, patching silences with imagination. Stone, for all its patience, forgets as well as remembers. Mountains erode, carrying away the records of forests that once grew along their slopes. Rivers scour cliffs, erasing signatures once pressed in sediment. Plate tectonics consumes entire seabeds, folding them into the mantle, remelting them until no trace remains. Memory here is not permanence but a cycle of writing and erasing, preserving only fragments scattered among absences. If the Earth is a library, its shelves are full of missing volumes, books left half-burned, pages blurred beyond reading. This memory is not whole but partial. Science recognizes this incompleteness and embraces it. Gaps in the fossil record, erratic intervals in isotope data, strata missing from cliffs where erosion carried chapters away, these gaps are not flaws but facts. They remind us that memory does not exist outside entropy. Every system tends toward disorder, and memory is no exception. What is preserved is as much chance as inevitability. Forgetting is a silent partner in the archive, one that shapes the story as much as what is left behind. And yet, even broken memory can be beautiful. What we do find, the spiral of an ammonite, the leaf veins of a cycad imprinted so delicately in stone they appear alive, moves us precisely because it is incomplete. It invites us to wonder, to imagine everything missing, to fill in the wide silences between fragments with speculation. In this way, the Earth's eroded memory becomes more than record. It becomes a canvas for curiosity. Half-truths are not lies, but openings, spaces where our imagination meets deep time. Perhaps our own memory is not so different. We forget names, faces, events until only outlines remain. We retain fragments and let details erode. Our sense of self, of history, of humanity, is built upon memory shaped as much by forgetting as by remembrance. We are not walking archives but patchworks, stitched together by what remains and loosened threads where time has dissolved the rest. Incomplete yet meaningful, partial yet sufficient to give shape to who we are. So when we touch the broken record of the Jurassic, when we admit how much is missing, we also recognize ourselves. The entropy that shapes our geology is the same entropy that shapes our perception. Memory cannot outpace it, neither in stone nor in mind. Perhaps the truest wisdom is this: forgetting is not failure, but part of the story. Without it, memory would lose its shape. Without erosion, valleys would not exist. Without loss, preservation would carry no meaning at all. Imagine standing before a cliff where strata reveal alternating bands of stone. Limestone carrying seashells, basalt marking eruptions, shale layered with fossils, then entire sections simply gone, swept away long before discovery. Looking upon it, you see narrative, interruption, silence. Standing before your own mind, tracing your life, you would see something similar. Sharp moments frozen, other years blurred, entire episodes lost. The cliff and the mind mirror each other, both are subjects of entropy, both archives shaped as much by forgetting as by record. In this recognition lies a strange comfort. We need not regret the incompleteness of memory. We need only accept that it is natural for both earth and mind. Forgetting gives meaning to what persists. Erosion makes mountains mortal. Entropy ensures that permanence, if it exists at all, can never be ours. What we have instead are echoes and fragments, enough to remind us of beauty, enough to inspire questions, never enough to grant certainty. And as the long Jurassic day bent closer toward its end, as silence deepened and memory dissolved into cycles larger than thought, the truth became clear. Losing is not absence. Forgetting is a kind of continuation. And just as memory erodes and drifts back into silence, so too does light itself. For even the brightest day must one day fall into darkness, its final chapters written not in presence, but in the faint glow of vanishing flame. The day, long and heavy with light, finally tipped into darkness. Shadows lengthened until they mingled together, and the sun withdrew from its passage across Jurassic skies. Forests quieted, oceans swallowed the last glimmer of gold, and still, life persisted. Insects moved through the dim air, ferns whispered in warm breeze, predators returned into silence, waiting patiently for their hour. The last light of this imagined day was not an ending for them. It was simply another dusk, another rhythm in cycles so natural that no creature could imagine its absence. And yet, as we look back across millions of years, dusk becomes symbol. Nightfall over the Jurassic does not merely mean hours. It gestures toward epochs, an impermanence that even the strongest life could not outlast. To us, the final light feels like an omen, the foreshadow of extinction waiting far ahead, the reminder that even the most abundant forests, the teeming reefs, the vast skies belonged only to borrowed time. But to the creatures themselves, dinosaurs, ammonites, dragonflies, the days close brought nothing of dread. For them, life was continuation, not remembrance. They did not know the tapestry we now try to stitch from their remains. The forests did not grieve their fading light. Ferns swayed, cycads held shadows within their folded fronds, and roots pressed deeper into soil that was itself older than most of what grew above it. The oceans did not pause their tides. They moved with indifference, carrying ammonite shells in their currents, redistributing warmth, whispering their ceaseless dialogue of entropy and renewal. For life in its moment, there was no sense of finality, no knowledge of being observed or remembered. Days ended, and nights began, and the cycles threaded their way forward with neither nostalgia nor prophecy. Science reminds us that this is how life proceeds, unaware of its eventual place in archives. Dinosaurs lived immersed in their present, as we live in ours, blind to the vast continuity outside perception. The spiral shells of ammonites, now held as fossils in our hands, once drifted without awareness that their geometry would one day symbolize time itself. Ferns exhaled oxygen with no sense that their labor would shape the very breath of future species. Life continues without foresight, and it is only in hindsight, reading faint traces through stone, that we weave meaning into their existence. But as the last sunlight fell across the Jurassic horizon, a paradox emerged. While the forests and oceans continued as though eternal, every creature was bound to vanish. Entire lineages walked through shadow unaware that their kind would one day disappear. Yet extinction was no less natural than dusk itself, a deeper night woven into the fabric of being. Perhaps this is why we feel the melancholy of an imagined last light, because it reflects back to us our own condition. We too walk in days that will one day be forgotten, our moments carried into silence until only fragments remain. Still, dusk was not despair, but beauty. The light falling across conifer canopies carved long shadows that stretched across valleys, drawing rivers into streaks of bronze. The sea glittered faintly, as if holding the gold of day before yielding to night's soft indigo. Winged shadows, pterosaurs and insects alike, crossed briefly across the dimming sky, vanishing into silhouettes as stars began their slow arrival. It was not an ending, but a transition, no different than the countless transitions before it. Nature's patience reminding itself that every dusk carries tomorrow. And so the last light of the Jurassic day, whether imagined or real, belongs to continuity. Life went on. Soil continued to breathe, roots to grow, rivers to carve, oceans to cycle. There was no mourning of epochs to come, no awareness of how we would one day attempt to read their traces in cliffs and fossils. There was only participation, the continuation of being in that moment, ignorant yet fulfilled. For us, looking back, the light is history. For them, it was simply light, fading as it always did. But in recognizing this, we uncover something profound. That our role is not to grieve endings as much as it is to learn from them, to recognize that life requires no permanence to be full. Memory matters to us because we fear forgetting, yet the earth itself carries no fear. Its archives are passive, its cycles unbroken, its patience absolute. Perhaps what we call endings are only the reshaping of light into shadow, the translation of presence into memory, the folding of one day into the next. And as night deepened over that unfathomably distant world, the forests continued to exhale, the oceans to move unseen, and the creatures to breathe, unaware of vast designs. Their lives were threads in a tapestry now mostly invisible, glimpsed in fossils scattered like stars within stone. And as we gather those fragments into stories, what remains is not the completeness of history, but its wonder, that something so ancient, so unreachable, can still shine faintly in the light of our imagination. And so the last light of this long Jurassic day does not close, but transforms, into silence, into memory, into curiosity that carries us further still. For night, too, holds lessons, and silence itself may be the greatest reminder of what endures when nothing else does. The question, then, as darkness falls, is simple. After all the echoes and fragments fade, what remains in silence? Every day ends in silence. The last breath of light gives way to shadow. The final ripple of wings disappears into the dark, and sounds recede until only stillness remains. This silence, ancient and persistent, greeted the end of every Jurassic day just as it greets our own. Yet to think of silence as absence is to miss its most important truth. Silence does not nullify presence. It enfolds it, carries it forward in ways softer, more enduring than sound. Silence is not where memory dies. Silence is where memory hides, for nothing is ever truly gone. The ammonite that drifted through Jurassic waters is long dissolved, its body lost to entropy, but its spiral endures in stone. The fern that unfurled in prehistoric sun has vanished from sight, but carbon traces its exhalations into coal and isotope. Even the mountains eroded into dust still carry their signature in the sediments they became, their fragments dispersed but not destroyed. Fossils, isotopes, dust. These are the murmurs, faint yet undeniable, that prove presence exists beyond time's erasure. Silence is filled with murmur. It is never empty. To listen to the earth is to hear silence speaking through matter itself. Isotopic ratios in a crystal tell of oceans that warmed and cooled across cycles of millions of years. Dust preserved in glacier ice repeats echoes of long-forgotten storms. Fossils testify not only to creatures that lived, but to entire ecosystems once lush with sound, preserved now within stillness. Geology teaches us again and again that silence is not blankness, it is archive. Each gap, each absence, each fragment tells us not of nothing, but of something once alive, once moving, brought quietly forward. And so forgetting, too, is never fulfillment of nothingness. It is transformation. Bones dissolve, but mineral replacements endure. Leaves decay, but impressions survive in shale. Voices fade, but isotopes mark their breath in stone. Silence is not denial, it is transference. What once made sound becomes matter. What once was presence becomes trace. What once was fleeting becomes patient beyond measure. Imagine standing in a quiet cliffside where Jurassic layers stretch in colored bands. The air hums only faintly with wind, your footsteps softened in dust. Yet within those striped walls are lives beyond counting. Shells spiraled into stone, forests collapsed into coal seams, volcanic eruptions frozen as dark bands of ash. All gone, yet all still here. The silence of the cliff is a monument full of voices that require no sound to remind us. It is a reminder that presence endures through change. And perhaps when we probe our own memory, we find the same. Our lives, too, fade into silences, our voices erased by years, our stories eventually forgotten. Yet something always remains. Fragments embedded in others, traces folded into culture, atoms dispersed into soil and sky. The silence we fear is less annihilation than dispersal, less void than a soft redistribution. And maybe this is enough. In Earth's slow memory, nothing is fully gone because everything is recycled into new existence. Silence also softens the harshness of time. If every detail of every life persisted, the world would be unbearable with noise. It is forgetting that creates space for new memory. It is silence that prepares the canvas again, allowing the next voices to write upon it. The absence is what makes the presence meaningful. The erasure is what allows the fossil to shine. For in a world where all is eventually reduced to murmurs, what remains is not despair but humility, a realization that even silence is full. Perhaps this is why silence is so often sacred to us. We find awe in stillness, comfort in hushed forests, eternity in starlit nights. Silence is the shape memory takes when language fails. It is the final rhythm of entropy and the first rhythm of renewal. Every Jurassic day ended not in collapse, but in a silence that connected it to the next dawn. Every extinction, however vast, folded into the silence that became foundation for something new. Every fossil we now touch was born not through sound, but because silence covered and preserved what would otherwise have vanished. The earth whispers this with patience. What remains in silence is not permanence, but continuity. Not clarity, but fragment. Not abundance, but enough. Even when half erased, the fragments survive just enough to remind us of the immensity of what we cannot recover. Silence gives us not the whole truth, but enough to feel connection. And in that connection, we learn to live with incompleteness as part of memory's design. As darkness swallowed the last light of the Jurassic day, as winds fell quiet and seas folded into shadow, the world continued. It continued unseen, unheard, in still cycles that endured night and would endure far greater losses still. And we, much later, learned to decipher that silence, to translate the fragments back into story, and to discover that silence itself had preserved what noise could not. So when we reach the final page of this long imagining, the question is no longer whether sound can endure, or whether memory can remain untouched. It is simpler. It is this. Can we accept silence as memory's final form? Can we see in fossils, isotopes, and dust not what is missing, but what continues? For what remains in silence is not nothing. What remains in silence is everything, translated into forms beyond recognition, waiting with infinite patience for us to listen.